The autumn sun hung low over the Colorado mountains, painting the aspen groves in shades of amber and rust. Elijah Thorne sat in his rocking chair on the wide porch of his ranch house, his weathered hands folded over a worn quilt that had once belonged to his wife. At 85 years old, his back remained straight, his green eyes still sharp despite the weight of decades. The Rocky Mountains stretched before him, eternal and unchanging, the same peaks he had known for more than half his life. Beside him stood his grandson Michael, 18 years old, and dressed in the crisp uniform of the United States Army. The boy's hands trembled slightly as he adjusted his cap, his face a mixture of pride and barely concealed fear. Tomorrow morning he would board a train heading east, joining thousands of other young men preparing for a war that loomed on the horizon like a dark storm cloud. "Grandpa," Michael said, his voice tight, "before I leave, I need to ask you something." Elijah turned his gaze from the mountains to his grandson's face. He saw himself there in the set of the jaw, in the determined eyes that fought against uncertainty. He saw Catherine, too, in the kindness that softened the boy's features. "Ask away, son." Michael shifted his weight from one foot to the other, a gesture of nervousness that reminded Elijah of a young colt testing unfamiliar ground. "The scar on Grandma's back. She never told me how she got it. But I saw the way you looked at it, sometimes like it was the most important thing in the world." A smile, sad and knowing, touched Elijah's lips. Catherine had been gone 2 years now, claimed by pneumonia, in the winter of 1930, but her presence lingered in every corner of this house, in every crease of this quilt, in every memory that time had burnished to a golden glow. "That scar was a bullet wound," Elijah said quietly. "And the story of how she got it is the story of how I found my life, my real life." Michael pulled up a chair, sitting forward with the eagerness of youth seeking wisdom from age. "Tell me. Please, I'm scared, Grandpa. Scared that when the time comes, I won't be brave enough." Elijah reached out and placed his hand on his grandson's shoulder, feeling the tension coiled there like a spring wound too tight. "Let me tell you about the bravest person I ever knew, and about how sometimes catching someone who's falling can change everything." He settled back in his chair, his eyes drifting to the distant peaks where his story had begun more than half a century ago. It was the fall of 1879. I was 32 years old and a mountain man who'd been living alone in these mountains for 12 years, running from ghosts and guilt. I thought I'd spend the rest of my days in solitude. Elijah's voice took on a different quality, then deeper and richer the voice of a man stepping back through the corridors of time. But on one September afternoon in a dusty little town called Ordway, everything changed. I caught a woman as she was falling, and in that moment both our lives began anew. The mountains seemed to shimmer in the fading light, and the years fell away like autumn leaves from the aspens. The streets of Ordway, Colorado baked under the late afternoon sun, dust rising in small clouds with each footfall. Elijah Thorne tied his horse to the hitching post outside Morrison's general store, checking the list in his pocket one more time. Flour, coffee, ammunition, salt. The essentials for a man planning to winter in a cabin 20 miles north of civilization. He had just paid the deposit on the old Mackenzie trading post, a solid structure built against a granite cliff face at 9,000 feet. It would be his first real home in over a decade. The town hummed with its usual sleepy rhythm. A blacksmith's hammer rang against an anvil somewhere down the street. Women in long dresses navigated the wooden sidewalks, their parasols casting small circles of shade. A dog sprawled in a patch of sunshine, too lazy to chase the chickens pecking at scattered grain near the feed store. Elijah's hand rested on the doorknob of the general store when he heard it. A woman's voice, high and desperate, cutting through the drowsy afternoon like a knife through butter. "Help someone, please." His body reacted before his mind could process the words. 12 years of mountain living had honed his instincts to a razor's edge. The voice came from somewhere around the corner, past the barbershop and the small office where old Doc Patterson kept his practice. Elijah's hand moved to the revolver at his hip as his feet carried him forward at a run. He rounded the corner of the barbershop just as the woman burst into view. She wore a simple black dress beneath a dark cloak, and as she ran, the hood fell back, revealing golden hair that streamed behind her like a banner. Her face, pale with terror, turned briefly in his direction, blue eyes wide with a fear so primal it seemed to reach across the space between them and grip his heart. Behind her, perhaps 30 yards back, a man in a dark coat raised a pistol. Elijah opened his mouth to shout a warning, but the sound of the gunshot drowned his words. The crack of the weapon echoed between the wooden buildings, sharp and final as a judge's gavel. He saw the woman's body jerk forward as the bullet struck her between the shoulder blades. Her arms windmilled, seeking purchase in empty air. Her knees buckled. She was falling. Time seemed to slow, each moment stretching like taffy pulled between greedy hands. Elijah's boots pounded against the hard-packed earth. The woman tilted forward, gravity claiming her, the ground rising to meet her with brutal indifference. 20 feet. 15. 10. His father's voice, clear as church bells on a Sunday morning, rang through his mind. Always catch those who fall, Elijah. That's what the Lord commands. That's what makes us human. Jonas Thorne had died living by those words, shot down by outlaws while trying to help a stranger. Elijah had spent 12 years in the mountains trying to outrun the guilt of what he'd done in revenge, trying to escape the memory of his father's blood soaking into the St. Louis street. But in that moment, none of it mattered. There was only the woman falling and his promise to a dead man that he would honor the lesson taught. Elijah dove forward, his arms outstretched. He caught her an instant before her face would have met the unforgiving dirt. The impact of her weight drove him to one knee, but he cradled her against his chest, one hand supporting her back, the other beneath her knees. Her blood, warm and wet, soaked immediately through his buckskin shirt. For a heartbeat, she looked up at him. Her eyes, the blue of a Colorado sky in winter, met his green ones. Pain clouded her gaze, but beneath it he saw something else. Recognition, perhaps. Or hope. Or simply the last desperate grasp of a drowning woman seeing a rope thrown from shore. "I've got you," he said, his voice rough from disuse. He spent most days speaking only to his horse in the wind. "I've got you, stay with me." Her lips moved, forming words he had to lean close to hear. "Please, don't let him." Then her eyes rolled back and consciousness left her like a bird taking flight from an open cage. Elijah looked up, searching for the shooter, but the man had vanished into the maze of alleys that webbed between Ordway's buildings. All around, doors began to open. Cautious faces peered out, drawn by the gunshot but wary of its aftermath. An old man stepped onto the sidewalk, his shopkeeper's apron marked with the day's work. "This woman's been shot," Elijah roared, his voice carrying the authority of desperation. "I need a doctor." Now, more people emerged, their shock giving way to urgency. A woman in a blue dress pointed down the street. "Doc Patterson's place is that way, second house past the barbershop." Elijah didn't wait for further directions. He rose to his feet, the woman light as a child in his arms, despite being full-grown. Her head lolled against his shoulder, and he could feel her shallow breathing, could see the terrible wound high on her left shoulder blade where the bullet had entered. Blood dripped from her back, leaving a trail of dark spots in the dust as he ran. Behind him, voices rose in confusion and alarm. He heard someone shout about getting the sheriff, heard the rapid footfalls of curious townspeople following at a safe distance. But Elijah's focus remained absolute. The woman in his arms was dying. Each second mattered. Doc Patterson's house stood whitewashed and neat, with a small sign hanging from the porch that read, "Samuel Patterson, M.D." Elijah took the 3 porch steps in a single bound and kicked the door open with enough force to make it bang against the inner wall. The doctor, a man in his 60s with steel-rimmed spectacles and a neatly trimmed gray beard, looked up from the book he'd been reading. His eyes widened, but his hands remained steady as he rose from his chair. Decades of frontier medicine had taught him to move quickly in a crisis. "On the table," Patterson commanded, gesturing to a sturdy wooden examination table in the center of the front room that served as his surgery. "Face down. Tell me what happened while I work." Elijah laid the woman as gently as he could on the table, arranging her so the wound was accessible. Patterson was already moving, gathering instruments from a glass-fronted cabinet, his movements efficient and precise. "She was running," Elijah said, stepping back to give the doctor room. "Man in a dark coat shot her in the back. Didn't get a good look at his face. I was focused on catching her." Patterson used heavy shears to cut through the woman's dress and the layers beneath. As the fabric fell away, Elijah saw the full extent of the injury. The bullet hole was high on the left shoulder blade, still oozing blood with each heartbeat. The skin around it had already begun to darken with bruising. "The bullet still lodged in there," Patterson said, probing gently with his fingers. "Missed the spine, thank God, but it's deep. I'll need to extract it." He looked at Elijah with sharp, assessing eyes. "Ever done this before?" "Dug bullets out of myself twice. A Ute warrior once and a grizzly another time." "Then you know this will hurt." She's unconscious now, but the pain might wake her. I need you to hold her still. Can you do that? Elijah moved to the head of the table, positioning his hands on the woman's shoulders. Her skin felt cold beneath his palms, shock setting in. I can do it. Patterson selected a pair of forceps from his tray of instruments, holding them briefly in the flame of an oil lamp to sterilize them. He poured whiskey over the wound, and even unconscious, the woman's body tensed at the sting of it. The doctor began to probe, and the woman's eyes flew open. A scream tore from her throat, raw and primal, the sound of a creature caught in a trap. Her body bucked, trying to escape the source of the agony, but Elijah's hands held her firm without crushing. Easy, he murmured, bending close so she could hear him over her own cries. The doctor's helping you. You've been shot, but you're going to live. Stay with me now. Her wild eyes found his face, and for a moment the pain seemed to recede enough for recognition to dawn. Who, she gasped, the single word costing her dearly. Name's Elijah Thorne, he said, keeping his voice steady and calm the way he would speak to a wounded animal. I won't let anything else happen to you, that's a promise. Her fingers clutched at his arm with surprising strength, nails digging into his buckskin sleeve. The ledger, she whispered, her voice barely audible. In my cloak. Don't let them. Another wave of pain swept over her as Patterson dug deeper, and her words dissolved into a cry that made something twist painfully in Elijah's chest. Then mercifully her eyes rolled back, and she lost consciousness again, her body going limp beneath his hands. Got it, Patterson announced, holding up the forceps. Caught in their metal grip was a deformed bullet, slick with blood. He dropped it into a tin dish where it landed with a small clink. Missed all the vital structures as far as I can tell. She's lost blood, but with proper care and no infection, she should recover. Relief washed through Elijah like cool water on a scorching day. He hadn't realized how tense he'd been, how much he had already invested in this stranger's survival. What can I do to help? Patterson was already cleaning the wound with whiskey-soaked cloths, his movements practiced and sure. She needs somewhere safe to recover, a week of bed rest at minimum. The hotel in town isn't secure, especially if someone's hunting her. He glanced up at Elijah. Do you know her? Never seen her before today. Then you're taking a considerable risk getting involved in whatever trouble she's running from. Patterson began stitching the wound closed with careful, even sutures. Smart man would walk away. Elijah thought about that for a moment. He thought about his father bleeding out in a St. Louis street while strangers stepped over him to avoid inconvenience. He thought about 12 years of self-imposed exile in the mountains, running from connection, from responsibility, from life itself. I've got a cabin 5 miles north of here, he said. Remote, defensible. She can recover there. Patterson's eyebrows rose slightly, but he didn't comment immediately. He finished the last stitch, tied it off, and began bandaging the wound with clean strips of linen. That's mighty generous for a stranger. Some might call it foolish. Someone shot a woman in the back in broad daylight. Elijah replied, his jaw tight. I aim to find out why and make sure they don't get a second chance. The sound of boots on the porch interrupted them, followed by a heavy knock. Patterson called out permission to enter, and the door swung open to admit Sheriff Henry Miller. The lawman was a stocky man in his mid-50s with a salt and pepper mustache and eyes that had seen too much of humanity's dark side. He removed his hat as he stepped inside, his gaze immediately finding the unconscious woman on the table. Heard we had a shooting, he said, his voice carrying the weariness of a man who dealt with such things too many times. When his eyes settled on the woman's face, something flickered across his features. Pain quickly suppressed. She going to make it, Sam? Should do if infection doesn't set in, Patterson replied, thanks to this gentleman's quick action. He gestured to Elijah. She'd have bled out in the street otherwise. Sheriff Miller turned his attention to Elijah, pulling a small notebook from his pocket. I'll need your statement, Mr. Thorne, Elijah Thorne. Tell me what you saw, Mr. Thorne. Elijah recounted the events, keeping his description precise and factual. The woman running, the man in the dark coat, the shot. His pursuit had been focused on reaching her, not on memorizing the shooter's features. Dark coat, medium build, maybe 5'10", Elijah finished. Age somewhere between 25 and 30. Wore his hat pulled low. I wouldn't recognize his face if I saw it again, but I'd know his walk. He limped on his right leg. Sheriff Miller made careful notes, his pencil scratching against the paper. And the young lady, anyone know who she is? Patterson gestured to the woman's clothing, now cut away, and lying in a heap beside the table. Among the dark fabric was a distinctive piece of cloth, white and black, unmistakable in its purpose. She's wearing a nun's habit and under that cloak, the doctor said. The sheriff's face went pale. His hand tightened on his notebook hard enough that Elijah heard the leather binding creak. For a long moment, Miller stood frozen, staring at the unconscious woman with an expression of such profound anguish that it bordered on physical pain. A nun, he repeated, his voice barely above a whisper. Patterson and Elijah exchanged glances. Clearly, this detail held significance beyond the obvious tragedy of violence against a woman of God. Sheriff Miller seemed to shake himself, pulling his professional demeanor back into place like a man donning armor. Did she say anything, give a name? Said her name before she passed out the first time, Elijah offered. Catherine, that's all I caught. Catherine. The sheriff wrote it down, but his hand shook slightly. He looked at the woman again and studying her face with an intensity that suggested he was searching for something specific. Where will she be staying during her recovery? When Elijah explained his offer of the cabin, Sheriff Miller gave him a long measuring look. You always take in strange women who get themselves shot, Mr. Thorne. Only when the alternative is leaving them to die in the street, Elijah replied evenly. The ghost of a smile touched Miller's weathered face. Watch yourself, son. We don't know who she is or what kind of trouble follows her. He tucked his notebook away and headed for the door, pausing with his hand on the frame. The man you described with the limp on his right leg. There's a fellow works for Victor Holloway up in Denver, name of James Barton. Fits that description. Victor Holloway. Patterson's voice carried a note of concern. The businessman? Wealthy, powerful, connected, Miller confirmed. If he's involved, this is bigger than a random shooting. He looked back at Elijah. You sure you want to step into something like this? Elijah's green eyes met the sheriff's, steady and unwavering. I'm sure. After Miller left, Patterson provided Elijah with supplies for Catherine's care. Clean bandages, laudanum for the pain, willow bark tea for fever, and detailed instructions on wound management. Together, they carefully transferred the still unconscious woman to Elijah's wagon, settling her on a bed of blankets with as much gentleness as two rough men could muster. Change the dressing twice daily, Patterson instructed, handing over a canvas bag of medical supplies. If you see redness spreading from the wound, or if she develops a fever that won't break, bring her back immediately. And keep her still. No riding, no heavy lifting. Her body needs time to heal. Elijah committed every word to memory. How long will she be unconscious? Hard to say. The body has its own wisdom about these things. Could be hours, could be until morning. The shock and blood loss will keep her under for a while. That's probably for the best. The pain will be considerable when she wakes. The journey to Elijah's cabin took the better part of 2 hours. The wagon road climbed steadily into the foothills, following the course of a creek that would eventually lead to the higher elevations where Elijah had made his home these past years. The afternoon sun slanted through the pines, casting long shadows across the trail. Aspen groves blazed gold and red against the darker green of the evergreens, autumn's fire burning bright before winter's inevitable frost. Elijah drove carefully, avoiding the worst of the ruts and rocks, but even his caution couldn't prevent every jolt. Each bump drew a soft moan from Catherine, unconscious though she was, and each sound made him wince in sympathy. He found himself talking to her, keeping up a steady stream of quiet words, even though she couldn't hear him. We're almost there, he said as the trail grew steeper. Got a good fire waiting, or we'll have soon enough. Warm bed. You'll be safe there, Sister Catherine. No one knows about that cabin except me and the ravens. The mountains rose around them, ancient and indifferent to human suffering. An eagle circled overhead, riding the thermal currents with lazy grace. Somewhere in the distance, an elk bugled its challenge to rivals, the sound echoing through the valleys. This was Elijah's world, had been for 12 years now. A world of silence and solitude, of seasons turning, without witness, of days bleeding into weeks, without another human voice to mark their passing. But now, carrying this wounded stranger toward his hidden sanctuary, he felt something stirring in his chest that he'd thought long dead. Purpose, maybe, or responsibility, or simply the knowledge that for the first time in over a decade, his actions mattered to someone other than himself. The cabin came into view as the sun touched the western peaks. It sat in a small clearing, backed by a wall of granite that rose 50 feet into the air. The structure was simple but solid, built by Elijah's own hands, from logs he'd felled and shaped. Smoke should have been rising from the chimney, but he'd left in such a hurry that morning that he'd let the fire die to embers. He'd remedy that soon enough. Elijah brought the wagon as close to the door as the terrain allowed, then carefully lifted Catherine into his arms. She weighed less than he'd expected, her body slight beneath the layers of torn clothing and bandages. He carried her inside and laid her on his bed, the only bed in the one-room cabin. It wasn't much, but the mattress was stuffed with fresh pine needles and sweet grass, and the bearskin blanket he spread over her was thick and warm. While Catherine slept, Elijah set about making the cabin habitable for an injured woman. He built up the fire until it roared, driving back the evening chill. He heated water in his largest pot, prepared a simple broth from dried venison, and arranged his medical supplies on the table where he could reach them quickly. Then he pulled his chair close to the bedside and settled in for what he suspected would be a long vigil. The night passed slowly. Elijah dozed in fits and starts, waking at every sound from the woman in his bed. Twice he changed the damp cloth on her forehead when a mild fever began to set in. 3 times he checked her bandage, relieved each time to find only minimal fresh blood seeping through. When she moaned in pain, he carefully administered small amounts of laudanum, enough to ease her suffering without endangering her already weakened state. The fire crackled and popped, casting dancing shadows on the log walls. Outside, the wind picked up, whispering through the pines with the voice of winter approaching. An owl called from somewhere in the darkness, hunting. Normal sounds, familiar sounds, but somehow different now that he wasn't alone. Elijah found himself studying Catherine's face in the firelight. She was young, he realized, probably 26 or 27. Her features held a refined quality that spoke of education and gentle upbringing, despite the hardships that had brought her to Ordway, running for her life. There was strength in the set of her jaw, determination visible even in unconsciousness. This was no helpless girl, but a woman who'd made hard choices and paid steep prices. "Who are you?" he murmured into the quiet cabin. "What terrible thing did you see that made someone want you dead?" The woman, of course, didn't answer, but her hand, lying atop the bearskin, twitched slightly, and Elijah found himself reaching out to cover it with his own rough palm. Her skin felt cool, and he told himself he was simply checking for fever, but he let his hand remain there longer than necessary. As dawn began to paint the eastern sky with streaks of pink and gold, Catherine stirred. Her eyelids fluttered, then opened slowly, confusion clouding her blue gaze as she tried to make sense of unfamiliar surroundings. Elijah saw the moment panic set in, saw her body tense for flight, despite the pain it must have caused. He leaned forward, making sure she could see him clearly, keeping his movements slow and unthreatening. "Easy, sister, you're safe. Don't try to move too fast." Catherine's eyes found his face and locked there, searching for recognition, for threat, for understanding. "Where?" The word came out as barely more than a whisper, her throat dry from hours of unconsciousness. "My cabin about 5 miles north of Ordway," Elijah answered, reaching for the cup of water he'd kept ready. "I'm Elijah Thorne. Do you remember being shot?" Her face crumpled slightly, memory flooding back. One hand moved instinctively toward her back, then stopped as pain lanced through her shoulder. "Yes," she managed. "You caught me." Elijah nodded carefully, helping her into a semi-sitting position so she could drink. He supported her with one arm while holding the cup to her lips, with the other letting her take small sips. "Doc Patterson removed the bullet, said you'd recover with time and rest." Catherine drank gratefully, the water easing the rasp in her throat. When she'd had enough, Elijah settled her back against the pillows he'd arranged. For a long moment, they simply looked at each other. Two strangers bound together by violence and circumstance. "Do you feel strong enough to tell me why someone was shooting at you?" Elijah asked gently. Catherine's eyes searched his face, and he saw her weighing her options, deciding how much to trust this mountain man who'd saved her life. Finally, she sighed a sound that carried the weight of months of fear and flight. "It's a long story," she said, her voice slightly stronger now, "and not a pretty one." Elijah settled back in his chair. "I've got time, and I've seen my share of ugly." Catherine studied him for another long moment, then seemed to come to a decision. "His name is Victor Holloway. He's a wealthy man from Denver who believes I've taken something that belongs to him." "And did you go?" A ghost of a smile touched her lips there and gone like sunlight through clouds. Yes, myself. At Elijah's puzzled expression, she continued, her words coming faster now, as if a dam had broken, and she couldn't stop the flood even if she wanted to. I wasn't always Sister Mary Catherine, she said. My name is Catherine Reed. I had parents once, a home, a younger brother named James. We lived on a small ranch near Pueblo. Nothing grand, but it was enough for us. Then when I was 12 years old, fever took both my parents within a week of each other. Elijah listened without interrupting, hearing the pain beneath her matter-of-fact delivery. James was only 10. We had no family, no one to take us in. The county placed us at St. Helena's Convent in Denver. They separated us, said James was being adopted by a good family. I never saw him again. Her voice caught slightly on those last words, and she paused to gather herself before continuing. I waited every day for someone to adopt me too. No one came. At 19, Mother Superior Agnes offered me a choice: leave with nothing or take vows and stay. I was scared. The convent was all I knew, so I chose the veil. Elijah understood that kind of choice, the desperate decision made when all alternatives seemed worse. You were alone and afraid. You did what you had to survive. I told myself I was serving God, Catherine said. For 7 years, I taught the children in the orphanage within the convent, reading, writing, arithmetic. I loved those children. They reminded me of James and myself. Her hands twisted the edge of the blanket, betraying her agitation despite her calm tone. Then 6 months ago, I noticed something wrong. Children began disappearing. Not many at once, just one every few weeks. Mother Superior said they'd been adopted, placed in good homes. But something felt off. What made you suspicious? Elijah asked. Little Mary Thompson, Catherine replied, her voice thick with memory. 8 years old, sweet as summer honey. She disappeared one night. Mother Superior said she'd been adopted by a wealthy family from Colorado Springs, but Mary left her doll behind. Her most precious possession, a rag doll her mother had made before dying. Mary never went anywhere without that doll. Catherine's blue eyes met Elijah's, and he saw the terrible knowledge there, the burden of truth too heavy to carry alone. I started watching, listening. Children were taken at night, always at night. I heard wagons arriving after dark. One night I followed one of those wagons. Her voice dropped to barely above a whisper. It went to a textile factory on the edge of Denver. I saw children inside, some barely 6 years old, working the machines in the lamplight. Their hands were bleeding. Guards watched them, and I recognized some of those children. They were from our orphanage. Elijah felt anger rising in his chest, cold and hard as mountain stone. They were selling the children. Catherine nodded, tears beginning to track down her cheeks. For labor, for money. And I realized then that James, my brother, the family that supposedly adopted him, what if he was sold too? What if everything I'd been told was a lie? So you went looking for proof, Elijah said, understanding dawning. I broke into Mother Superior's office. It took me 3 hours with a hairpin to pick the lock. Inside her desk, I found a ledger, 15 years of transactions, names, ages, dates, amounts, paid destinations. Catherine's voice shook with barely controlled fury. 300 children over 15 years, some as young as 4 years old, all sold like cattle to factories, mine's wealthy households that wanted servants they didn't have to pay. She reached toward her cloak, which Elijah had laid carefully over a chair. He brought it to her, and she showed him the hidden pocket in the lining. With trembling fingers, she withdrew a thin, leather-bound book. I copied every entry, every name, every signature. She opened the ledger, showing him pages filled with neat handwriting. Victor Holloway's name appears on almost every transaction. He's the mastermind. He owns the factories where most of the children are sent. Mother Superior provides the children. Holloway places them. They split the profits. Elijah took the ledger, scanning the entries. Each line represented a child, a life stolen and commodified. Mary Carson, age 8, Riverside Textile Mill, $45. Thomas Baker, age 6, Harrington Household Domestic Service, $30. The list went on, page after page of systematic evil. Then one entry made him stop cold. Emma Miller, age 15, transferred to Denver Household, $75. Below it, in different ink, a later notation, deceased 6 months after transfer. Sheriff Miller's daughter, Elijah said quietly. Catherine's eyes widened. The sheriff has a daughter named Emma. Had. She died at St. Helena's Convent 12 years ago. At least that's what they told him. Said it was fever. Never let him see the body. Elijah's jaw tightened. Because there wasn't one. She was still alive when they sold her. Catherine searched through the ledger, finding the entry. When she read it, her hand flew to her mouth. Oh God, that poor man. And there are hundreds more like Emma. Hundreds of children who should have been safe, who should have been cared for, who were instead treated as inventory. She looked up at Elijah, her face fierce despite the tears. That's why I ran. I took this copy of the ledger and fled in the night. I planned to make it to California, find a federal marshal who wasn't in Holloway's pocket. But he found out I'd taken it within days. He sent men after me. I've been running for 3 months. And they caught up with you in Ordway, Elijah finished. I thought I'd lost them. I was wrong. Catherine's voice broke. The man who shot me, Sheriff Miller said his name might be James Barton. Elijah nodded. My brother's name was James Reed. If he changed his name after being sold, if Holloway got to him and turned him into... She couldn't finish the sentence, couldn't voice the horror of it. Elijah stood, walked to the window, and looked out at the mountains bathed in morning light. For a long moment, he was silent, processing everything he'd heard. Behind him, he heard Catherine's ragged breathing, felt the weight of her gaze on his back. Finally, he turned to face her. My father was Jonas Thorne, Methodist preacher in St. Louis. Good man, truly good in a way most of us only pretend to be. He taught me one lesson above all others. Always catch those who fall, Elijah. That's what the Lord commands. That's what makes us human. Elijah's voice roughened with old grief. When I was 20 years old, I saw 3 outlaws gun him down in the street. He'd stepped in to help a woman they were robbing. They shot him for his trouble. I held him while he died. Catherine's expression softened with sympathy, but Elijah wasn't finished. I tracked those men for 2 weeks, killed all 3 of them. It was justice, but it felt like murder. The weight of it, what I'd done, even for the right reasons, it broke something in me. So I came to these mountains, and I've lived alone for 12 years, running from myself, from connection, from life. He crossed the room and knelt beside the bed so they were eye level, his green eyes meeting her blue ones with an intensity that made the air between them seem to crackle. But yesterday I caught you when you fell, and something in me woke up, something I thought had died with my father. He reached out and carefully took her hand. I won't let Holloway or his men take you. When you're healed, we'll get that ledger to someone who can use it. Those children deserve justice. Your brother James, wherever he is, whatever he's become, deserves to know the truth. And you deserve to be free. It's dangerous, Catherine whispered. You could be killed. Elijah's smile was slight but genuine. I've faced grizzlies, blizzards, and loneliness that could break a man's mind. I reckon I can handle one corrupt businessman and his hired guns. Why, Catherine asked the question barely audible. Why would you risk everything for a stranger? Elijah squeezed her hand gently. Because it's right. And because when I caught you falling, Catherine Reed, I remembered what it feels like to care about something beyond my own survival. I've been dead inside since my father died. But holding you, seeing your courage despite your fear, I felt alive again. For a long moment, they simply looked at each other, an understanding passing between them that went beyond words. Then Catherine's eyes grew heavy, exhaustion claiming her once more. Rest now, Elijah said softly, releasing her hand and standing. You're safe here. I'll keep watch. As Catherine drifted back to sleep, Elijah returned to his chair by the bedside. Outside, the sun climbed higher, burning off the morning mist. Somewhere in the forest, a raven called, its voice harsh and knowing. The mountains stood eternal witnesses to countless dramas of life and death, triumph and tragedy. Elijah Thorne, mountain man in self-imposed exile, sat watching over a wounded nun who carried proof of unthinkable evil, and for the first time in 12 years, he felt like he had a purpose beyond mere survival. He didn't know yet that the man who'd shot her was indeed her brother. Didn't know that before this was over, he'd face a battle that would test every skill he'd learned in his dozen years of mountain living. Didn't know that the woman sleeping fitfully in his bed would become the center of his world, his reason for living, his salvation. But as the morning light filled the cabin with a golden warmth, Elijah made a silent promise to his dead father and to the woman he'd caught falling. He would see justice done. He would protect Catherine Reed with his life, and he would never again run from what mattered. Always catch those who fall. It was time to start living by those words again. The first week of Catherine's recovery passed in a rhythm as old as healing itself. Pain followed by rest, weakness followed by incremental strength, fear gradually giving way to cautious hope. Elijah tended her wounds with a gentleness that seemed at odds with his rough exterior. Twice daily he changed her bandages, his calloused fingers surprisingly deft as they cleaned the injury and applied fresh dressings. He brewed willow bark tea for the pain, made rich broths from venison and wild herbs, and kept the fire burning through the cold mountain nights. Catherine, for her part, struggled with the indignity of helplessness. She who had cared for dozens of orphaned children, who had run from danger for 3 months, who had survived a gunshot wound, now needed assistance to sit up, to eat, to move from bed to chair. But Elijah's matter-of-fact manner made it bearable. He treated her injuries as he would have treated any wounded creature, with efficiency and without judgment. On the third day, she was strong enough to sit in the chair by the fire. Elijah helped her there in the late afternoon, wrapping the bearskin around her shoulders against the autumn chill that crept through the cabin walls. From this vantage point, she could watch him work, and she found herself fascinated by the competence of his movements. He cooked with the same precision he applied to everything else, measuring ingredients by eye and instinct. He cleaned his weapons with reverent care, checking each mechanism, oiling moving parts. He mended a tear in his spare shirt with stitches that, while not pretty, would hold. A man who lived alone, she realized, learned to do everything or died trying. "You're very self-sufficient," Catherine observed, breaking a comfortable silence that had stretched between them for the better part of an hour. Elijah looked up from the leather straps he was repairing, a slight smile touching his bearded face. "Living alone teaches you everything. Cook clean, so doctor yourself, or perish. The mountains don't care about your incompetence. Most men wouldn't admit to sewing. Most men have wives to do it for them." He returned to his work, pulling the leather tight. "I've had only myself for company these 12 years. Catherine watched the firelight play across his features, casting shadows that emphasized the strength in his jaw, the weathering that spoke of years exposed to wind and sun. "Have you been lonely?" The question hung in the air between them. Elijah's hands stilled, and for a moment she thought he wouldn't answer. Then he set aside his work and met her gaze directly. "Yes," he said simply, "though I didn't let myself admit it until recently." Before Catherine could respond, Elijah stood and crossed to a shelf near his bed. He returned with 3 books, their covers worn from handling. "You said you taught reading at the orphanage. I thought maybe you'd like something to occupy your mind while you heal." Catherine took the books with reverent hands. Shakespeare's collected works, a Bible with gilt edges, and a copy of Pilgrim's Progress. "You read—" The surprise in her voice was evident. Elijah's expression tightened almost imperceptibly. "My father was a preacher. He made sure I could read before I could ride. Mountain men aren't all savages, Sister Catherine." "I didn't mean to imply—" Catherine began, flustered. "I'm sorry, I spoke without thinking." The tension in Elijah's shoulders eased. "I take no offense. Most folks assume a man who chooses the wilderness over civilization must be running from book learning along with everything else." He gestured to the volumes in her lap. "Truth is, books are one of the few things I miss about living among people. Words on a page: don't judge, don't demand, don't betray." Catherine opened the Shakespeare, finding the pages marked with notes in a careful hand. Observations about the characters, questions about meanings, reactions to particularly moving passages. "You've studied these deeply." "Had nothing but time." Elijah returned to his chair. "But I haven't read aloud to another person since my father died. Forgot what some of the harder words sound like." An idea formed in Catherine's mind, one that would serve them both. "Would you like me to read to you? My back aches if I tried to hold a book for long, but I could read aloud. We could discuss what we read the way I used to with the older students." Something shifted in Elijah's expression, a softening that made him look younger, less burdened. "I'd like that. I'd like that very much." And so a new ritual began. Each evening after supper, Catherine would read while Elijah worked on whatever task occupied his hands. She started with the Bible, figuring it was safest, but soon moved to Shakespeare at Elijah's request. His enthusiasm for the tragedies surprised her. His insight into the characters' motivations even more so. Hamlet's not really mad, Elijah said one night, and as Catherine closed the book. He's drowning in grief and guilt, lashing out because he doesn't know how else to deal with the pain. I understand that. Catherine studied him in the firelight. Is that how you felt after your father died? Still feel it sometimes. The guilt more than the grief now. I killed 3 men, Catherine. Hunted them down and shot them like animals. They deserved it. God knows they deserved it, but that doesn't make the weight any lighter. He stared into the flames. That's why I came to the mountains. To escape what I'd become. Or to punish yourself for doing what had to be done, Catherine suggested gently. Your father taught you to protect those who fall. You protected his memory the only way you knew how. Elijah's green eyes met hers and she saw the hunger in them, the desperate need to be understood, to be forgiven. You think Pa would have approved? I think your father would have grieved for the burden you carry, but understood the love that drove you to carry it. They sat in silence for a long while after that, the fire crackling, the wind singing through the pines outside. Something had shifted between them, some barrier crossed. They were no longer simply rescuer and rescued, but 2 damaged souls finding unexpected kinship in shared pain. By the 5th day, Catherine could walk around the cabin unassisted, though her back still ached and sudden movements sent sharp reminders of her injury. She began helping with small tasks, peeling vegetables for stew, folding Elijah's spare clothes, organizing the herbs he'd gathered for winter storage. He protested at first, insisting she should rest, but she persisted. I'll go mad lying around like an invalid, she told him firmly. Let me help. It makes me feel useful. They developed a rhythm, working side by side in companionable silence, broken occasionally by conversation. Elijah taught her about mountain herbs, which could be eaten, which had medicinal properties, which would kill if mistaken for their harmless cousins. Catherine shared stories from the orphanage, tales of children she'd loved and lost, small triumphs and heartbreaking failures. There was a boy named Thomas, she said one afternoon as they prepared vegetables for stew, 6 years old when he came to us, terrified of everything. Wouldn't speak for the first month. I spent hours just sitting with him, reading aloud, not demanding anything. Finally, one day he climbed into my lap during story time and fell asleep. It felt like the greatest victory in the world. What happened to him? Elijah asked, though he suspected he knew the answer. Catherine's hand stilled the potato forgotten in her grip. He's in the ledger. Sold to a mining operation in Leadville when he was 8. I pray every night that he's still alive, that someone there shows him kindness. Her voice broke. But I know the chances are slim. Children don't last long in the mines. Elijah set down his knife and crossed to her, taking the potato from her trembling hands and setting it aside. You did what you could for him. You gave him kindness when he needed it most. That matters, Catherine. Even if it couldn't save him, it matters. She looked up at him, tears streaming down her face. Does it? When the ending is the same either way? Yes. Elijah's voice carried absolute conviction. Because you showed him love exists. Even if he dies in a mine shaft, he'll die knowing that once someone cared. That's more than many people get. Catherine leaned forward, her forehead resting against his chest, and wept. Elijah stood awkwardly for a moment, unsure what to do, then slowly brought his arms around her, holding her while grief and rage and helplessness poured out in racking sobs. He smelled of pine smoke and leather and something indefinably masculine, a scent that somehow made her feel safe even as her world crumbled around her. When her tears finally subsided, she pulled back, embarrassed by her display. I'm sorry, I shouldn't have. You needed to cry, Elijah said simply, and I was here. No apology needed. On the 8th day, they had a visitor. The sound of hoofbeats in the clearing brought Elijah to instant alertness, his hand moving to the Winchester rifle that leaned against the wall. Stay inside, he commanded, his voice brooking no argument, away from the windows. Catherine obeyed, moving to the back of the cabin, while Elijah positioned himself at the door, rifle ready. Through a gap in the shutter, he watched a young man in a deputy's badge ride into the clearing, looking nervous and out of place in the wild mountain setting. Mr. Thorne, the deputy called out. It's Thomas Clark. Sheriff Miller sent me to take Sister Catherine's statement. Elijah relaxed slightly, but kept the rifle in hand as he opened the door. Deputy, you're a long way from town. Clark dismounted, holding his hands where Elijah could see them. Sheriff wants a proper statement from the lady if she's well enough to give it. His eyes took in Elijah's defensive posture, the rifle, the remote location. He also wanted me to check that she's being cared for properly. She's healing well, Elijah said. Come in, but slowly. Inside, Catherine sat by the fire wearing the simple blue dress Elijah had purchased from Morrison's general store on one of his supply runs to town. Her hair, freed from the confines of her nun's veil, fell in golden waves around her shoulders. Deputy Clark's eyes widened slightly at the sight of her, clearly not expecting such a beautiful woman. Ma'am, he said, removing his hat, I need to ask you some questions about the shooting if you're able. Elijah had coached Catherine on what to say. Keep it simple. Don't mention the trafficking yet. Don't give them reason to connect her to Holloway until they were ready. She played her part perfectly, describing herself as a widow traveling to California to join distant relatives attacked by a stranger for reasons she couldn't fathom. Can you describe the man who shot you? Clark asked, pencil poised over his notebook. It happened so fast, Catherine said, her voice weak and tremulous. I saw a dark coat, medium height perhaps, but his face I never saw it clearly. I was running terrified. Everything blurs together. Clark made notes, though his expression suggested he found the lack of detail frustrating. And you have no idea why someone would attack you? None whatsoever. Perhaps he thought I had money, though I can't imagine why he'd think a lone woman traveling would carry much of value. The deputy asked a few more questions, but Catherine's story remained consistent and frustratingly vague. Finally, he closed his notebook and stood. Well, ma'am, you're fortunate Mr. Thorne was there. The man who shot you left town the morning after the incident. Sheriff says he headed west, probably figures you're dead. After Clark departed, Elijah checked the perimeter of the cabin, carefully looking for any sign that they'd been followed or watched. He found nothing unusual, but the deputy's visit had reminded him of how exposed they were. Anyone could find this cabin if they looked hard enough. That night, as Catherine read from Pilgrim's Progress, Elijah interrupted her mid-sentence. We need to talk about what happens next. Catherine set the book aside. What do you mean? If Holloway thinks you're dead, that buys us time. But men like him, they're thorough. He'll want confirmation. He'll send someone to verify. Elijah leaned forward, his elbows on his knees. This cabin isn't defensible enough. One man with a rifle could pin us down from the tree line. We need somewhere with better sight lines, more protection. Do you have somewhere in mind? The trading post I mentioned, the one Sarah Mackenzie owned, and 20 miles northwest of here, higher elevation. It's built against a cliff face, so there's no way to approach from behind. Clear fields of fire in all directions. Only one road and easy to watch. He met her eyes. It's also where I was planning to settle, start a new life. I'd already put money down on it. Catherine absorbed this information slowly. You're saying we should move there together. I'm saying you need somewhere safe to finish healing, and I need to know I can defend you if trouble comes. The trading post serves both purposes. Elijah hesitated, then added, it also has 2 rooms. You'd have privacy, propriety. A small smile touched Catherine's lips. You're worried about my reputation, Elijah. I'm a woman who abandoned her religious order and is living alone with a man in a mountain cabin. My reputation, such as it was, is thoroughly destroyed. You didn't abandon your order. You fled corruption. The outside world won't see the distinction. She stood, wincing slightly at the pull in her back, and moved to the window. Outside, stars blazed in the clear mountain sky, more stars than she'd ever seen from the convent, where city lights dimmed the heavens. But you're right, we should move. If it's safer, if it gives us a better chance when Holloway's men come, then that's what we do. It's a hard journey, several hours on horseback. Your wound will hurt whether we stay or go. Catherine turned to face him. I'm stronger than I look, Elijah. I've survived 3 months on the run, survived being shot, survived losing everything I thought my life was about. I can survive a few hours of discomfort. Elijah studied her face, seeing the steel beneath the delicate features, the determination that had kept her alive this long. We'll leave at first light. But Catherine, once we're at the trading post, I'm going to teach you to defend yourself. How to shoot, how to reload under pressure, how to take cover. If Holloway's men come, you need to be able to fight. I'll learn, Catherine promised, whatever it takes. They traveled the next morning, Catherine on Elijah's gentlest mare, cushioned by furs to protect her healing wound. The journey wound through pine forests and aspen groves, following game trails that only Elijah seemed able to see. He navigated the wilderness with the ease of long familiarity, never hesitating at forks in the path reading the land like other men read books. They stopped at midday in an alpine meadow where a crystal creek burbled over smooth stones and wildflowers still bloomed in defiance of approaching winter. Elijah built a small fire and made coffee while Catherine sat on a fallen log, soaking her feet in the cold water. "Tell me about Sarah Mackenzie," she said as Elijah handed her a tin cup of coffee. "The woman who owned the trading post." "Sarah was remarkable," Elijah said, settling onto the log beside her. "Widow woman who ran that post alone for 30 years after her husband died. Traded with trappers, miners, occasional Ute bands passing through. Also served as the healer for anyone within 50 miles. Women especially would come to her for childbirth, women's troubles, things the male doctors didn't understand or care about." "How did she die?" "Pneumonia last winter. She was 68 years old. Found her in her bed, peaceful like she'd just gone to sleep, and decided not to wake up." Elijah stared into his coffee. "She left no family, no heirs. The property sat empty until I came along and made an offer to the bank." Catherine heard something in his voice, a note of regret or loss. "You cared for her." "She was kind to a lonely mountain man who didn't deserve kindness. Every time I'd come to trade furs, she'd have coffee, ready a meal if I'd stay. Never asked about my past, never judged my choices. Just treated me like a human being when I'd half forgotten how to be one." He looked at Catherine. "You'd have liked her. She had your strength, your compassion." "I hope I can honor her legacy," Catherine said softly. They reached the trading post in late afternoon. The structure sat in a valley surrounded by evergreens, its back wall flush against a sheer granite cliff that rose 50 feet into the air. The main building was larger than Elijah's cabin, constructed of thick logs that spoke of permanence and security. A porch faced the valley, offering a view that stretched for miles. Outbuildings included a barn, a smokehouse, and a root cellar dug into the hillside. Catherine slid from her horse legs, trembling from the long ride, and stood looking at what might become her new home. "It's beautiful," she breathed. Elijah helped her inside, his hand on her elbow, more to reassure than to support. The interior was dusty from months of disused furniture covered with sheets, but the basic structure remained sound. The main room served as the trading area with a long counter and empty shelves waiting to be stocked. Behind it, a door led to the living quarters, 2 bedrooms separated by a kitchen area with a cast-iron stove. "The bedroom on the left was Sarah's," Elijah said. "It's yours now if you want it." Catherine explored the room, finding it simply furnished but comfortable. A bed with a rope spring mattress, a dresser, a washstand. But what caught her attention was the shelf above the bed, where a row of leather-bound journals sat gathering dust. "Are these Sarah's?" she asked, carefully removing one and opening it. Elijah appeared in the doorway. "Must be. I didn't know she kept journals." Catherine read the first entry, dated 1850. "I have come to these mountains to escape my first husband's family. They sought to control me through his estate, to make me nothing more than a vessel for producing heirs and managing their household. Here I am free to be myself, to build a life on my own terms." "She was running too," Catherine murmured, turning pages. "Just like me." Over the next weeks, the trading post became their home and Catherine's schoolroom. Elijah proved to be a demanding but patient teacher, drilling her relentlessly in the skills she'd need to survive. The shooting lessons began on the third day. He started her with a rifle, teaching her the fundamentals of stance, breathing, sight picture, trigger pull. Catherine's first shot kicked harder than she expected, the recoil bruising her shoulder. She missed the target, a tin can perched on a fence post by several feet. "Again," Elijah said simply. She tried again, and again, and again. By the end of the first hour, her shoulder ached, her ears rang from the gunshots, and she'd only hit the target twice. But Elijah seemed pleased. "You're not flinching anymore," he observed. "That's the hardest part for most people to overcome. The anticipation of recoil makes them pull the shot. You're learning to control it." By the end of the first week, Catherine could hit a tin can at 50 yards more often than she missed. Elijah moved her to pistol training, a smaller .38 revolver that fit her hand better than his larger Colt. "Rifles for distance," he explained. "But if someone gets past that, you need something for close quarters. This revolver holds 6 shots. Make each one count, because you won't have time to reload in a fight." Catherine practiced quick draws, learned to fire from cover, trained until the weight of the gun in her hand felt natural instead of foreign. Her competence grew with each passing day, and with it, her confidence. But Elijah didn't stop at weapons training. He taught her to read tracks, showing her how to distinguish a deer's hoof print from an elk's, how fresh snow on a boot print indicated someone had passed within the hour. He showed her which plants were edible, which had medicinal properties, which would kill if mistaken for their harmless cousins. "Why are you teaching me all this?" Catherine asked one afternoon as they checked trap lines together. "I thought we were just preparing to defend the trading post." Elijah stopped turning to face her. "I'm teaching you to survive. If something happens to me, if you have to run again, you need to know how to live in these mountains. Knowledge is survival out here." The thought of him not being there, of facing the wilderness alone, sent a chill through Catherine that had nothing to do with the autumn air. "Nothing's going to happen to you. Can't promise that, but I can promise you'll be ready for whatever comes." They fell into domestic rhythms that felt dangerously comfortable. Each morning, Catherine made coffee while Elijah tended the horses. They'd eat breakfast together, planning the day's work. Afternoons were split between training and chores, fortifying the trading post's defenses, stocking supplies for winter. Evenings found them by the fire, Catherine reading from Sarah's journals or from the books Elijah had brought from his cabin, both of them contributing observations and building a shared understanding of literature and life. One evening, as they worked together to repair the trading post's shutters, Catherine became aware of how close they were standing, how his hand brushed hers as they positioned the heavy wooden panel. She looked up and found him watching her, his green eyes intense in the lamplight. "What?" she asked softly. "I was just thinking how different this place feels with you here, like it's alive again." Catherine's breath caught. "Elijah." He reached up and tucked a strand of her golden hair behind her ear, his fingers lingering against her cheek. "I know this is complicated. I know you took vows, that you're still figuring out who you are outside the convent. But Catherine, these weeks with you, I've felt more alive than I have in 12 years. "I feel it too," she whispered, "and it terrifies me." "Why?" "Because I don't know if what I feel is real, or if it's just gratitude or relief at being safe, or—" She trailed off, unable to articulate the confusion in her heart. Elijah's hand dropped away, and he stepped back, giving her space. "Take your time. I'm not going anywhere." But the awareness between them remained a current of possibility that hummed beneath every interaction. 3 weeks after their arrival at the trading post, Sheriff Henry Miller came riding up the road. Elijah spotted him through his spyglass before the lawman reached the clearing. "It's the sheriff, alone." Catherine felt her heart rate quicken. "Do you think he's found something?" "Only one way to know." They met Miller on the porch, Elijah's rifle conspicuously present but not aimed. The sheriff dismounted slowly, his movements those of a man whose body ached from hard riding. "Mr. Thorne, Sister Catherine." He tipped his hat. "Mind if we talk? It's important." Inside, Catherine poured coffee while the men settled at the table. Miller's weathered face carried deep lines of exhaustion and something else. Grief, perhaps, or rage, barely contained. "I've been doing some investigating." Miller began, wrapping his hands around the warm cup. Quiet, like asking questions that wouldn't get back to Victor Holloway. "Found some interesting connections." "What kind of connections?" Elijah asked. "Holloway sits on the boards of 3 orphanages and 2 convents across Colorado. All of them report unusually high rates of children being adopted by families that can't be traced. He also owns textile mills, mining operations, and has partnerships with several households in Denver that employ an awful lot of domestic servants who seem to appear out of nowhere." Catherine's hands tightened around her own cup. "He's been doing this for years, systematically." 15 years, according to what I've found." Miller's voice roughened. "Sister Catherine, you said you had a ledger. Would you be willing to show it to me?" Catherine looked at Elijah, who nodded slightly. She retrieved the leather-bound book from its hiding place and set it before the sheriff. "This is a copy I made. Every entry from the original that I could transcribe before I had to run." Miller opened the ledger, his hands beginning to shake as he turned pages. Catherine watched his face, saw the moment he found what he was looking for. His fingers stopped on a page dated 1800, and all the color drained from his weathered features. "Emma Miller." He read aloud, his voice barely a whisper. "Age 15. St. Helena's Convent, Denver. Transferred to household Victor Holloway, Denver. Payment $75. His finger moved down. Deceased 6 months after transfer. The sheriff closed his eyes and Catherine saw a tear escape down his lined cheek. They told me she died of fever. Said her body was too far gone to view, that I should remember her as she was. I believe them. I'm so sorry, Catherine said, her own eyes burning with sympathetic tears. Your daughter was sold. Miller's voice turned to steel. Sold to the man who now sends killers after you. And then she died, and they lied about it. He opened his eyes, and Catherine saw murder there, barely restrained. What did he do to her? How did she die? I don't know, Catherine admitted. The ledger only shows the transaction and the notation of death. But if she's marked deceased, if Holloway was involved, she couldn't finish the sentence, couldn't voice the horrible possibilities. Miller stood abruptly, pacing to the window, his back rigid with barely controlled emotion. For a long moment he said nothing, simply stared out at the mountains that his daughter would never see again. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of terrible resolution. I want to help you. Not as a lawman, though that too. As a father who failed to protect his child. You have evidence that could destroy Holloway and everyone involved in this evil. But we need more than just the ledger. What do you mean? Elijah asked. A good lawyer could claim the ledger is a forgery. We need witnesses' testimony from people who know the operation from inside. We need someone who worked for Holloway to turn against him. Miller faced them again. I've been tracking James Barton, the man who shot you. He's back in Denver working out of Holloway's office. If we could get to him, convince him to testify. He won't, Catherine said flatly. If Barton is who I think he is, Holloway owns him. He'll never turn. People can surprise you when their backs are against the wall. That night, Catherine couldn't sleep. She sat by the window in her room, staring out at the star-filled sky, thinking about Emma Miller, about James, about all the children whose names filled that terrible ledger. Behind her, Sarah Mackenzie's journals sat on the shelf, chronicles of a woman who'd built a life on her own terms, who'd helped hundreds of people over 3 decades. A soft knock at her door startled her from her reverie. Come in, she called. Elijah entered carrying 2 cups of tea. Saw your lamp burning. Thought you might want company. They sat together by the window, sipping the tea in silence. Finally, Catherine spoke. Do you ever wonder if we're doing the right thing, if exposing all this is worth the danger? Every day, Elijah admitted. But then I think about those children, about Emma Miller, about your brother James. They deserve better. They deserve justice, even if it comes too late. I'm afraid, Catherine whispered. Not of dying, but of failing. What if we can't stop him? What if Holloway wins and goes right on selling children? Elijah set down his tea and took her hand. Then at least we tried. At least we stood up and said, this is wrong. That matters, Catherine. Even if we fail, bearing witness to evil matters. She looked at their joined hands, his large and calloused, hers smaller, but growing stronger from weeks of mountain work. Elijah, I need to tell you something. About my vows. He waited, patient as always. I've been thinking about them, praying about them. I spoke those vows when I was 19 years old, alone and terrified, seeing the convent as my only option. I told myself I was serving God, but the truth is I was just surviving. I never had a true calling to religious life. I had fear and no alternatives. You don't need to explain yourself to me, Elijah said gently. Yes, I do, because what I'm about to say affects you. Catherine took a deep breath. I'm renouncing my vows. I'll write to the bishop, make it official, but in my heart, I'm already decided. I'm not Sister Mary Catherine anymore. I'm just Catherine Reed, and I'm free to choose my own path. Elijah's expression softened. What path are you choosing? I don't know yet, but I know it starts here in these mountains with a man who caught me when I fell and taught me how to stand again. They sat in silence after that, hands still joined, something profound settling between them. Not quite a declaration, not yet a promise, but an acknowledgement of possibility that hadn't existed before. The moment was shattered by sound from outside, a branch snapping, the crunch of boots on dry leaves. Elijah was on his feet instantly, rifle in hand. Someone's out there. Catherine followed him to the main room. Her heart pounding, Elijah peered through a gap in the shutter, his body tense as a drawn bowstring. Can't see much in the darkness, but someone's definitely moving around out there. More than one person, I think. He turned to Catherine. Get your revolver. Stay away from the windows. They waited in the darkness, weapons ready, listening to the sounds of movement outside. Footsteps circled the trading post, deliberate and unhurried, as if whoever was out there wanted to be heard. Then just before dawn, the sounds faded and silence returned. Elijah waited until full daylight before venturing outside. What he found made his blood run cold. Boot prints in the soft earth near the creek. Cigarette butts at least half a dozen. Someone had stood watch over the trading post for hours. He followed the tracks to where they had met the road, found evidence of horses, multiple riders. They'd come, watched, and left. But they'd be back. "We're not safe here anymore," he told Catherine when he returned. "Whoever that was, they know where we are now." "Then we prepare," Catherine said, her voice steady despite the fear in her eyes. "You said this place was defensible, so we defend it." Over the next days, they fortified the trading post with grim determination. Elijah reinforced the shutters with sheet metal from Sarah's old supplies, creating rifle slots that would allow them to shoot from cover. He set traps along the approach road, tripwires connected to cans that would rattle a warning, a carefully positioned rock slide that could be triggered with a single rope pull. Catherine helped with everything, her healing wound protesting the heavy work, but her determination overriding the pain. Together, they stockpiled ammunition, food, medical supplies. They positioned weapons at strategic points throughout the building. They planned escape routes if the worst happened. And each night, exhausted from preparation, they found comfort in each other's company. Catherine would read from Sarah's journals, finding wisdom in the old healer's words. Elijah would share stories from his years in the mountains, opening up in ways he never had before. The walls between them crumbled brick by brick, conversation by conversation. One evening, 10 days after the mysterious watchers had come, Catherine set aside the journal she'd been reading and looked at Elijah seriously. "I need to tell you something else," she said, "about how I feel." Elijah set down the leather strap he'd been working on. "Go on." "These weeks with you, I've felt more alive, more myself than I ever did in 7 years at the convent. You've taught me to be strong, to fight, to survive. But more than that, you've shown me what it means to be truly cared for, not as a charity case or a lost soul to be saved, but as a person of value." Her voice shook slightly. "Elijah Thorne, I'm falling in love with you." The words hung in the air between them, momentous and terrifying. Elijah stood slowly across the room and knelt beside her chair so their eyes were level. "Catherine Reed," he said, his deep voice gentle, "I've been in love with you since the moment I caught you falling. I just didn't have the courage to say it until now." He cupped her face in his hands and Catherine leaned into his touch, her eyes closing. When she opened them again, she saw the question in his gaze, the request for permission. She answered by closing the distance between them. Their first kiss was tentative, exploratory, two people learning the shape of each other's mouths, the taste of shared breath. Then Catherine's hand came up to tangle in Elijah's hair, pulling him closer, and the kiss deepened, months of unspoken longing pouring into it. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Elijah rested his forehead against hers. "When this is over," he said, "when Holloway is dealt with and you're truly free, I want you to stay here with me, not as someone hiding, but as my wife. Build a life in these mountains. What do you say?" "Yes," Catherine whispered without hesitation. "When this is over, yes." They might have said more, might have sealed their promise with another kiss, but the sound of hoofbeats approaching froze them both. Multiple horses coming fast up the road toward the trading post. Elijah moved to the window, spyglass in hand. What he saw made his jaw clench. Riders, 6 of them, and they're not trying to hide. Catherine joined him, peering through the gap. Even without the spyglass, she could make out the lead rider on a magnificent black horse, his fine clothes and commanding posture unmistakable even at a distance. "Victor Holloway," she breathed. "He's here." The riders stopped about 100 yards from the trading post, spreading out in a semicircle that blocked the road. Holloway sat his horse with the confidence of a man used to getting what he wanted. His handsome face twisted into a smile that held no warmth. Beside him sat 5 hard-looking men, all armed, all watching the trading post with professional assessment. "Sister Catherine," Holloway's voice carried clearly in the mountain air, "I know you're in there. Let's talk like reasonable people." Elijah's response was to fire a single shot from his Sharps rifle, the bullet hitting the ground 3 feet in front of Holloway's horse. The animal reared and Holloway struggled to control it. "Leave now while you still can," Elijah's voice rang out. This is your only warning. Holloway's face darkened with rage. He turned to his men, giving orders that Catherine couldn't hear. Two of the riders spurred forward, charging toward the trading post. Here we go, Elijah muttered, taking aim. But before he could fire, there was movement from the trees to the north. A single rider burst from the forest, riding hard, cutting between Holloway's men and the trading post. The newcomer's horse slid to a stop in a spray of dirt, and the rider dismounted with practiced ease. Stop, the man shouted. Everyone just stop. Catherine's breath caught as the man turned, his face visible for the first time. She'd know those features anywhere, even after 16 years. The same eyes as hers, the same bone structure, aged and hardened but unmistakable. James, she whispered. James Barton, the man who had shot her, stood between them and Holloway's approaching men, his hands raised and empty. Catherine, he called out, it's me. It's really me. We need to talk. Elijah's rifle never wavered. Give me one good reason not to shoot you where you stand. Because I'm her brother, James shouted back, and because I'm here to help. The standoff stretched for a heartbeat, 2 heartbeats in eternity, compressed into seconds. Then James Barton did something that spoke volumes. He unbuckled his gun belt and let it fall to the ground. Then his rifle, pulled from his saddle, lay carefully in the dust. A knife from his boot followed. I'm unarmed, he called. Catherine, please, let me explain. Holloway's voice cut across the clearing. Barton, what the hell do you think you're doing? James turned to face his employer, and even from a distance, Catherine could see the contempt in her brother's expression. I'm choosing my sister over your blood money, Holloway. Something I should have done the moment I learned who she was. You'll regret this, Holloway snarled. I already regret everything I've done for you. Adding one more thing to the list won't matter. Elijah looked at Catherine. Your call. He claims to be your brother. Do we let him approach? Catherine's mind raced. This could be a trick, a ploy to get someone inside their defenses. But she'd seen James's face, seen the resemblance to the boy she'd lost 16 years ago. And she'd heard something in his voice, a desperation that sounded like truth. Let him come, she decided, but keep him covered. Walk forward slowly, Elijah commanded. Hands on your head. Any sudden moves and I'll drop you. James complied, walking with deliberate slowness across the open ground. As he drew closer, Catherine could see him more clearly. He was lean, hardened by years of hard living, with a face that showed the cost of violence. He limped slightly on his right leg, just as Elijah had described. But his eyes, when they met hers through the window, held a mixture of shame and desperate hope. Close enough, Elijah said when James was 10 feet from the porch. Say what you came to say. James's gaze fixed on Catherine, visible now through the open door, where she stood, revolver in hand. Kathy, God, you grew up. Last time I saw you, you were 12 years old, crying in the courtyard of that convent as they dragged me away. They said you were being adopted, Catherine said, her voice shaking. They said a good family wanted you. They lied. I was sold to a factory owner for $50. Worked 16-hour days making textiles until I was 16. Then I escaped, lived on the streets for 2 years, nearly died a dozen times. James's voice cracked. Victor Holloway found me when I was 18. He trained me, gave me purpose, made me into what I am. A killer. Why are you here? Catherine demanded. If you work for him, why betray him now? Because 2 days ago I saw the original ledger, the one you copied. Holloway showed it to me, bragging that you'd stolen nothing but a fake. That's when I saw our names. Catherine Reed, age 12, retained at convent. James Reed, age 10, sold to Harrington Textile, $50. His hands fell from his head, and Elijah's rifle tracked the movement, but James made no threatening gesture, just stood there, broken and exposed. I confronted him, asked if he knew what he'd done to us, to me. He laughed, said I should be grateful that the factory taught me discipline. James reached slowly into his jacket, moving with exaggerated care. That's when I stole the original ledger from his safe and ran. If you have a copy and I have the original, Holloway can't claim forgery. We can destroy him. He pulled out a leather-bound book and held it up. Even from a distance, Catherine could see it was identical to the copy she'd made. Throw it here, Elijah commanded, gently. James tossed the ledger onto the porch. It landed with a soft thud, and Catherine moved quickly to retrieve it. Opening it, she saw the same entries she'd copied months ago, but these were in the original hand with genuine signatures that no lawyer could dispute. If you took that, Holloway knows, Elijah said. He knows you're here. Yes, James admitted. He left Denver with 6 men this morning. But I rode hard to get here first to warn you to give you this. Holloway's voice cut through the tension. Well, this is touching. A family reunion. But you're all dead, you realize. I have 5 good men, all armed, all willing to do what needs to be done. Actually, Sheriff Miller's voice rang out from the tree line. You have 3 men. Your other 2 surrendered when they saw my deputies' rifles pointed at them. Catherine's heart leapt as the sheriff emerged from cover 4 armed deputies flanking him. They'd approached through the forest while everyone's attention was focused on James, and now they had Holloway and his remaining men surrounded. Miller walked his horse forward slowly, his badge glinting in the afternoon sun. Victor Holloway, you're under arrest for child trafficking, conspiracy, and the murder of Emma Miller. Holloway's face went purple with rage. You have no authority here. This is federal land, which is why federal marshals are waiting in Ordway to take custody of you, Miller replied calmly. I'm just here to make sure you don't run. He looked at Catherine. And to see justice done for my daughter and all the other children you destroyed. For a moment it seemed like Holloway might surrender. His men were already lowering their weapons, clearly unwilling to die for a man whose crimes had just been laid bare. But then Holloway's hand moved toward his jacket. Everything happened at once. Elijah's rifle cracked. The bullet struck Holloway's shoulder, spinning him in the saddle. His horse reared, screaming. One of Holloway's men, a thick-set brute with a scarred face, grabbed for his gun. Deputies fired, and the man dropped, clutching his leg. But the chaos provided cover for the other 2. A lanky man with cold eyes dove behind a wagon, coming up firing. His first shot shattered a shutter beside Catherine's head, sending splinters flying. His second punched through the door, missing Elijah by inches. The third man, Marcus Webb, used the distraction to spur his horse forward in a desperate charge. He was Holloway's enforcer, a professional killer who'd survived a dozen gunfights through speed and ruthlessness. As bullets flew around him, he rode straight for the trading post, leaning low over his horse's neck. Elijah tracked him with the rifle-fired mist. Webb was moving too fast, zigzagging in the saddle. Another shot, another miss. Webb reached the porch and threw himself from the saddle, crashing through the reinforced door with the weight of his body and momentum. The impact drove the door inward, frame splintering. Webb rolled as he hit the floor, came up with both pistols drawn. Nobody move! For a frozen instant, the scene crystallized. Elijah stood near the loft ladder, rifle empty, needing to reload. Catherine stood behind the trading counter, her revolver raised, but Webb already had her covered. James remained outside, unarmed, helpless. Webb's eyes flat and emotionless as a snake's fixed on Catherine. Drop it, sister, or I'll put a bullet through that pretty face. Catherine's hands trembled on the revolver. She'd trained for this, practiced quick draws and firing from cover. But practice was different from having a professional killer's guns pointed at your heart. Catherine, Elijah said quietly, carefully. Do what he says. Smart man, Webb said. He was breathing hard from his charge, but his hands remained steady. Now, Thorne, you drop that rifle. Slow and easy. Elijah set the rifle down, his eyes never leaving Webb's face. You won't get out of here alive. Miller has you surrounded. Maybe, but I'll take you 2 with me if I don't. Webb gestured with one pistol. You mountaineering man, against the wall. Sister, step out from behind that counter. Hands where I can see them. Catherine moved slowly, emerging from her protected position. Her revolver lay on the counter where she'd set it, useless now. Webb circled to keep both of them in his line of sight, positioning himself near the shattered door where he could see outside. Through the opening, Catherine could hear Sheriff Miller shouting, Webb, it's over, Holloway's down, surrender, and you'll live to stand trial. Webb's laugh was ugly. I've stood trial before, Sheriff. I know how that ends. I'm not dying in prison. His eyes flickered to Elijah. Here's what's going to happen. Sister Catherine is coming with me. She's my ticket out of here. Anyone tries to stop me, she dies. He moved toward Catherine in 2 quick strides, grabbing her arm and spinning her around. One pistol pressed against her temple, cold and hard. His other gun remained trained on Elijah. Don't, Elijah said, his voice carrying a warning that made Webb pause. You hurt her, and there's no place on earth you can hide from me. Touching, Webb's arm tightened around Catherine's throat, using her as a shield. But I'm walking out of here with her, and you are going to let me. Because if you don't, her brains paint that wall. He began backing toward the door, dragging Catherine with him. She stumbled, her feet tangling with his, but he was strong, hauling her along. Elijah stood frozen, watching his fists clench so tight his knuckles showed white. Catherine felt panic rising in her throat, the same helplessness she'd felt when she was shot, when she'd run for 3 months, when violence had controlled her fate. But then beneath the fear, something else stirred. Anger. And the memory of Elijah's voice during training. If someone grabs you from behind, you've got advantages. They can't see your face, can't watch your hands. Use that. Webb was focused on Elijah on the door on his escape. He couldn't see Catherine's face set with determination. Couldn't see her hands position themselves, fingers spread. In one explosive movement, Catherine stomped down with all her strength on Webb's instep. She felt bones crunch beneath her heel. Webb's grip loosened fractionally as pain lanced through his foot, and Catherine drove her elbow back and up into his ribs with every ounce of force she possessed. The breath whooshed out of Webb's lungs. His arm around her throat slackened, and Catherine dropped, breaking his hold, rolling away, across the floor just as Elijah had taught her. Webb, cursing, swung his guns toward her. But Catherine kept rolling, came up behind the counter, snatched her revolver from where she'd left it. Her hands were steady now. All fear burned away in the heat of action. Webb fired. The bullet splintered wood inches from Catherine's head. She didn't flinch. Aimed, fired. The .38 bucked in her hand and Webb staggered. Her bullet had caught him high in the chest, not immediately fatal, but enough to break his concentration. He turned toward her, raising his guns again. Elijah dove for his rifle, came up firing from one knee. The Winchester's roar filled the trading post. Webb jerked as the bullet struck him center mass, driving him backward. He crashed against the wall and slowly slid down, leaving a red smear behind him. His pistol slipped from his hands, clattering on the floor. Webb looked down at the growing red stain on his shirt, then up at Catherine, who still had her revolver aimed at him. "Well," he wheezed, "didn't see that coming. You fight like a wildcat, sister." His eyes glazed over and he slumped sideways, dead, before he hit the floor. Catherine stood there, revolver still raised, her hands beginning to shake now that the immediate danger had passed. Elijah was at her side in 3 strides, taking the gun gently from her grip, gathering her into his arms. "You did it," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "You saved yourself, Catherine. I couldn't get to you in time, and you saved yourself." Catherine buried her face in his chest, her body trembling with the aftermath of violence. "I killed him. I killed a man. You defended yourself. There's a difference." Elijah held her tighter. "And you were magnificent. Everything I taught you, used it perfectly." Outside, the sounds of conflict had ceased. Sheriff Miller appeared in the doorway, taking in the scene, the dead enforcer, Catherine in Elijah's arms, the bullet holes scarring the walls. "Everyone all right in here?" "We're fine," Elijah said. "Webb's dead." Miller nodded. "Holloway's wounded but alive. His other men are secured." His eyes softened when they found Catherine. "I heard what happened. Heard you broke free and shot back. That took courage, Miss Catherine. Real courage." James pushed past Miller into the trading post, his face pale. "Kathy, are you hurt? Did he—" "I'm fine," Catherine said, pulling away from Elijah and turning to face her brother. "I'm fine, James." They stood awkwardly for a moment, 16 years of separation, a chasm between them. Then Catherine crossed the space and hugged her brother fiercely. James stood rigid for a heartbeat, then his arms came around her and he shook with the force of emotions too long suppressed. "I'm so sorry," he whispered, "for everything. For shooting you, for working for him, for not being strong enough to see the truth sooner." "You're here now," Catherine said. "You brought the evidence we needed. You chose right when it mattered most." When they finally separated, James looked at Elijah. "Thank you for protecting her, for teaching her to fight. If you hadn't—" "She saved herself," Elijah said simply. "I just gave her the tools. Catherine did the rest." Miller cleared his throat. "We need to get these bodies sorted and Holloway secured. James, I'll need your full statement. You're probably looking at charges as an accessory." "I understand," James said. "I'll tell you everything. Every transaction, every name, every crime I witnessed in 8 years." As Miller's deputies began the grim work of securing prisoners and dealing with the dead, Catherine walked outside into the fading afternoon light. The valley stretched before her, mountains rising eternal against the sky. Somewhere overhead, an eagle cried. She'd been running for so long. 3 months as a fugitive, a year of 7 years hiding behind convent walls, her whole life it seemed spent in fear. But standing here now with the smell of gun smoke still in the air, and the knowledge of what she'd just done settling in her bones, Catherine felt something shift. She wasn't running anymore. She'd stood and fought. She'd saved herself. Elijah came to stand beside her, his hand finding hers. "What are you thinking?" "That I'm tired of being afraid," Catherine said. "That I want to build something instead of just surviving." She looked up at him. "I want the life you offered me, here with you in these mountains." "Well, then that's what we'll build," Elijah promised. Together. The trials began in early winter of 1879 and stretched through the coldest months Colorado had seen in a decade. Catherine and Elijah made the journey to Denver 3 times, staying in a modest boarding house, while Catherine gave her testimony in the federal courthouse. Each time the courtroom packed with spectators, journalists scribbling furiously as the full scope of the trafficking conspiracy unfolded. Victor Holloway sat in chains, his fine clothes replaced by prison gray, his aristocratic bearing gradually crumbling, as witness after witness condemned him. Catherine testified for 2 full days, walking the jury through the ledger entries, explaining what she'd witnessed at St. Helena's convent, describing the night she'd followed the wagon to the textile factory. Her voice never wavered, though. Elijah, sitting in the gallery, saw how her hands trembled when she identified Holloway as the architect of the entire operation. James Barton testified for 3 days. He detailed 8 years of working for Holloway, naming every transaction he had facilitated, every child he had helped transfer, every bribe paid to corrupt officials. His testimony was methodical, damning, and clearly painful. When the prosecutor asked why he'd finally turned against his employer, James looked directly at Catherine. "Because I learned that one of the children he'd sold was me, and one of the women I'd been sent to kill was my sister. That's when I realized I'd become the very evil I'd once been a victim of. I had to stop it, even if it cost me everything." The defense tried to discredit him, pointing to his criminal history, his years as Holloway's enforcer. But the ledgers spoke for themselves, 2 identical books with signatures that handwriting experts confirmed were genuine. Combined with testimony from freed children, hospital records of injuries, and financial documents showing Holloway's profits, the evidence formed an insurmountable wall. Mother Superior Agnes testified in her own defense, claiming she'd believed the children were being properly adopted. But when prosecutors produced her signed receipts for payment, her carefully constructed lies collapsed. She wept on the stand, though, whether from genuine remorse or fear of punishment, no one could say. The verdict came on a gray February morning, guilty on all counts. Victor Holloway was sentenced to life imprisonment at hard labor. Mother Superior Agnes received 25 years. Judge Morrison and Senator Blackwood, caught in the conspiracy's web, were stripped of their positions and sentenced to 15 and 20 years respectively. But it was the final count that mattered most to Sheriff Henry Miller. Murder in the death of Emma Miller. The hospital records that Catherine had seen referenced in the ledger were found and entered into evidence. A young girl beaten severely, admitted to Denver General Hospital in the summer of 1867. She died 3 days later from internal injuries. Before death, she'd given a statement to the attending physician, naming Victor Holloway as the man who'd hurt her. The judge's words rang through the courtroom like bells of judgment. "Mr. Holloway, you have treated children as commodities, destroyed families, corrupted institutions meant to protect the vulnerable, and murdered a 15-year-old girl whose only crime was being powerless. This court sentences you to hang by the neck until dead sentence to be carried out 90 days hence." Catherine sat beside Sheriff Miller when the sentence was read, and she felt the lawman's hand tighten on the armrest of his chair. A single tear tracked down his weathered face, and she reached over to cover his hand with her own. "She has justice now," Catherine whispered. "Emma has justice." "Because of you," Miller replied, his voice rough. "Because you were brave enough to run and smart enough to get proof. Thank you doesn't seem like enough." In April of 1880, Victor Holloway was executed in the yard of the Colorado Territorial Prison. Catherine didn't attend, but James did, standing witness to the end of the man who'd shaped and nearly destroyed his life. When he returned to the trading post 3 days later, he told Catherine only that Holloway had died unrepentant, cursing everyone who'd testified against him. "Good," Catherine said simply. "Let him carry his hatred to whatever judgment awaits him. We have better things to do with our lives." James had received a reduced sentence in exchange for his testimony, 5 years to be served at a minimum security work camp. But the federal judge, impressed by his cooperation and genuine remorse, suspended the sentence on condition that James remain in Colorado under Sheriff Miller's supervision and commit no further crimes. "You'll need honest work," Miller told him, "and someone to keep an eye on you. Make sure you stay on the straight path." "My sister offered me work at the trading post," James said, "if that's acceptable." Miller nodded. "It's acceptable, but James, understand this. You take one step back toward your old life, you hurt anyone you even think about committing a crime, and I'll see you in prison for the full 5 years. Are we clear?" "Crystal clear, Sheriff. I'm done with that life. I want to be the man my sister deserves to have as a brother." Spring came late to the high country that year, but when it arrived, it transformed the mountains into a celebration of life. Wildflowers carpeted the meadows in waves of purple, yellow, and red. The aspens leafed out in brilliant green. Elk calves wobbled on new legs beside their mothers. The world seemed to be renewing itself, and Catherine felt that renewal in her own heart. Reverend Thomas Ashford made the journey from Ordway at Elijah's request, arriving on a bright morning in late May. The elderly minister had been Jonas Thorne's closest friend, and though age had bent his back and silvered his hair, his eyes still held the keen intelligence and gentle wisdom that had made him beloved by his congregation. "Young Elijah," he said, embracing the mountain man who'd once been a boy in his Sunday school class, "your father would be so proud of the man you've become, catching those who fall just like he taught you." "Reverend, I'd like you to marry us," Elijah said without preamble. "Catherine and me, here at the trading post with the mountains as our church." Ashford looked at Catherine, studying her with the piercing gaze of a man who'd counseled countless souls. "You've left your religious order, I understand." "I have, Reverend. The church formally released me from my vows last month. I'm free to marry if that's your concern." "My concern is whether you're choosing this freely, not out of gratitude or obligation or lack of other options." Catherine met his gaze steadily. "I'm choosing Elijah because I love him, because he saw me at my most vulnerable and didn't turn away, because he taught me strength that I didn't know I had, because when I imagine my future, he's in every part of it. Is that free enough for you, Reverend?" Ashford smiled, the lines around his eyes crinkling with approval. "That'll do nicely. When would you like the ceremony?" They chose the first Monday in June, giving them time to prepare and allowing word to spread to those they wanted present. Sheriff Miller would give Catherine away, standing in for the father she'd lost, Dr. Patterson, and his wife would attend along with a dozen trappers, miners, and settlers who'd come to know Elijah over the years. James would stand as Elijah's best man, a role that symbolized his complete rehabilitation in his sister's eyes. The morning of the wedding dawned clear and perfect, the sky an impossible blue, unmarred by even a wisp of cloud. Catherine woke in her room at the trading post, sunlight streaming through the window, and for the first time in her adult life, felt pure, uncomplicated joy. She'd made her wedding dress herself, sitting up late by lamplight for weeks using fabric Dr. Patterson's wife had helped her select from the general store. It was simple white muslin with a fitted bodice and full skirt, no train or excessive ornamentation. But when she put it on, looking at herself in the small mirror Sarah Mackenzie had left behind, she felt beautiful. James knocked on her door as she was weaving wildflowers into her hair. Columbines and Indian paintbrush, the colors of Colorado's high country. "You look like Ma," he said softly, standing in the doorway. "I remember her wearing flowers in her hair like that when I was little." Catherine's eyes misted. "I wish she could be here. And Pa." "They're here," James assured her. "In you and me and the fact that we survived and found each other again. That's their legacy." He offered his arm. "Sheriff Miller's waiting on the porch, but before we go out there, I want to say something." Catherine waited, seeing her brother struggle to find words adequate to the moment. "You saved me," James finally said. "Not just by exposing Holloway, but by forgiving me when I didn't deserve it, by giving me a second chance. I'm going to spend the rest of my life being worthy of that gift." "You already are," Catherine replied, hugging him tightly. "You already are, little brother." They'd set up chairs in the meadow below the trading post where the view stretched for miles, and the sound of the creek provided natural music. Reverend Ashford stood beneath an arch James and Elijah had constructed from aspen branches, waiting with his Bible open and a smile on his weathered face. Elijah stood beside him, dressed in new buckskins and a white shirt that Catherine had made for him. His long hair was tied back, his beard neatly trimmed. When he saw Catherine emerge from the trading post on Sheriff Miller's arm, his expression transformed into something between awe and reverence. Catherine walked slowly down the grassy aisle between the chairs, her eyes locked on Elijah's. She barely registered the guests, the perfect weather, the mountain backdrop. There was only him waiting for her with a smile that held 12 years of loneliness finally ending. Sheriff Miller placed Catherine's hand in Elijah's, his own eyes damp. "Take care of her," he said gruffly. "She's special." "I know," Elijah replied, "and I will." Reverend Ashford's voice carried across the meadow, strong despite his years. "Dearly beloved, we are gathered here in the sight of God and these witnesses to join Elijah Thorne and Catherine Reed in holy matrimony. This is not a union entered into lightly, but one forged in hardship, tested by trial, and proven through sacrifice." He looked at Elijah. "Your father Jonas Thorne was my dearest friend. He taught you to catch those who fall, and you've lived by that teaching. Today you don't just catch Catherine. You pledge to walk beside her, to lift her up when she stumbles, and to let her lift you in return. That's what marriage is, son. Two people choosing each other day after day through every season life brings." Turning to Catherine, Ashford continued, "You've journeyed far from where you started through darkness that would have broken lesser souls. But you persevered, you fought, you survived. And in surviving, you found not just safety, but love. That's grace, child. Pure grace." The vows were simple, traditional, but spoken with an intensity that made them feel newly minted. "Elijah, do you take Catherine to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better, for worse, for richer, for poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish until death parts you?" "I do," Elijah said, his deep voice steady and sure. "Catherine, do you take Elijah to be your lawfully wedded husband with the same promises?" "I do," Catherine replied, her voice ringing clear across the meadow. The rings were simple gold bands purchased by James during a trip to Denver. As Elijah slipped his onto Catherine's finger, he spoke the words James had helped him practice. "Catherine, I promise to catch you when you fall, stand with you when you fight, and love you all my days." Catherine's hands shook slightly as she placed Elijah's ring on his finger, but her voice remained strong. "Elijah, I promise to choose you every morning, build our life with you every day, and love you with all I am for all our years. By the power vested in me by the territory of Colorado and the grace of Almighty God," Reverend Ashford proclaimed, "I now pronounce you husband and wife. Elijah, you may kiss your bride." Elijah cupped Catherine's face in his hands, his touch gentle despite his strength, and kissed her with a tenderness that brought tears to many watching eyes. When they finally parted, both were smiling, both transformed from two wounded individuals into something greater together. The celebration that followed was simple but joyful. Dr. Patterson's wife had organized the women to prepare a feast: venison and trout, fresh bread, vegetables from early gardens, pies made with dried fruit. Someone produced a fiddle and music filled the meadow as afternoon stretched toward evening. Catherine danced with Elijah, both of them laughing at their clumsiness, neither having danced in years, or in Elijah's case ever. They swayed together, finding their own rhythm, creating their own steps. "I don't know what I'm doing," Elijah admitted, nearly stepping on her foot. "Neither do I," Catherine laughed. "We'll figure it out as we go." "That seems to be our pattern," Elijah observed, spinning her gently. "Figuring things out together." Sheriff Miller raised a toast as the sun began to set. "To Catherine and Elijah, may they find in these mountains the peace they've earned, the love they deserve, and the life they've fought so hard to build. And may they never forget that sometimes catching someone who's falling is how we learn to fly ourselves." Glasses clinked, voices raised in agreement, and Catherine felt a completeness she'd never known possible. She'd lost her parents, lost her childhood, lost years to fear and running. But she'd gained a partner who understood her depths, a brother redeemed, a purpose that extended beyond mere survival. As the guests began to depart in the fading light, Catherine and Elijah stood on the porch of the trading post, their hands clasped, watching the last riders disappear down the mountain road. "Ready to start our life together, Mrs. Thorne?" Elijah asked. Catherine smiled, leaning into his warmth. I've been ready since the moment you caught me falling, Mr. Thorne. I just didn't know it yet. The months that followed the wedding brought a rhythm of work and purpose that filled Catherine's days with satisfaction. The trading post came alive under their joint management. Elijah handled the actual trading, bartering with trappers for furs, stocking supplies that miners and settlers needed. Catherine transformed the back rooms into a healing center, using the knowledge from Sarah Mackenzie's journals combined with her own growing expertise. Women began traveling considerable distances to see her. The territory had few doctors and even fewer who understood women's health. Catherine delivered her first baby in August, a healthy girl, born to a miner's wife who'd had no one else to turn to. The labor lasted 16 hours and Catherine stayed throughout, coaching, encouraging, finally helping guide the infant into the world. When the baby's first cry split the air and Catherine placed the squirming bundle on her mother's chest, something shifted inside her. This was what Sarah Mackenzie had done for 30 years. This was service that mattered, healing, that saved lives and built community. More cases followed. A rancher's wife with a difficult pregnancy, a young girl with a fever that wouldn't break, an elderly woman with pain in her joints that conventional medicine couldn't ease. Catherine treated them all, charging only what people could afford, often accepting payment in eggs or vegetables or simple gratitude. James settled into life at the trading post with surprising ease. He proved to have a knack for carpentry, building shelves and furniture, repairing what broke. In the evenings, he'd often sit with Elijah and Catherine, the three of them talking or playing cards or simply enjoying companionable silence. The wounds of his past didn't heal overnight, but slowly Catherine saw her brother becoming whole again. In November, a young widow named Mary Henderson came to the trading post, seeking medicine for her 7-year-old son's persistent cough. Catherine treated the boy, but she noticed how Mary's eyes kept finding James, how she smiled when he helped carry her purchases to her wagon. "She likes you," Catherine observed after Mary had left. James ducked his head, embarrassed. "I'm not fit for courting, not with my past." "Your past doesn't define your future," Catherine countered. "Mary's a good woman who deserves happiness, and you deserve a second chance at life, not just existence." It took 3 more visits before James worked up the courage to ask if he could call on Mary. By Christmas, he was spending Sundays at her small ranch, helping with chores and charming her son with stories of mountain adventures carefully edited to remove the darker elements. Winter settled over the high country with its usual fierce beauty. Snow piled deep, and for weeks at a time, the trading post was cut off from the outside world. Catherine and Elijah learned each other in the intimacy of isolation, discovering preferences and quirks, building a shared life in the quiet hours by the fire. Catherine read aloud from Sarah's journals, finding entries that spoke to her own journey. One passage written in 1855 seemed particularly early poignant. "I came to these mountains running from men who wanted to control my life through my late husband's estate. I thought I was seeking refuge. What I found instead was purpose. In healing others, I healed myself. In building community, I built a family of choice rather than blood. Freedom, I've learned, isn't about escaping from something. It's about choosing what you're running toward." Sarah was wise, Elijah observed, looking up from the leather straps he was repairing. "She'd be proud of what you're doing, carrying on her work." "I hope so," Catherine said. "Sometimes I feel her presence here, like she's watching, approving." As winter began to loosen its grip and the first hints of spring appeared in the longer days and melting snow, Catherine began to feel strange. A persistent queasiness in the mornings, exhaustion that sleep didn't cure, tenderness in her breasts. She recognized the symptoms from her midwifery work, but couldn't quite believe they applied to her. She waited another week, wanting to be certain before telling Elijah. She chose a quiet evening after supper when they sat by the fire as was their custom. "Elijah, I need to tell you something." He set aside the book he'd been reading, giving her his full attention. "What is it?" "I'm pregnant." The words came out as barely more than a whisper. "We're going to have a baby." For a long moment, Elijah simply stared at her, his expression cycling through shock, wonder, and finally pure joy. Then he was on his feet, crossing to her chair, lifting her into his arms and spinning her around the room. "A baby!" he shouted, his voice cracking with emotion. "We're having a baby!" Catherine laughed, dizzy from the spinning and from happiness. "Careful, you'll make me sick." He set her down gently, immediately contrite. Are you all right? Do you need to sit? Should you be resting? I'm pregnant, not dying, Catherine assured him, but she let him fuss, seeing how much he needed to do something with the overwhelming emotion coursing through him. That night, as they lay in bed, Elijah's hand rested on Catherine's still flat stomach. What do you think, boy or girl? Does it matter? Not even a little bit. He kissed her temple. As long as both of you are healthy, I'll be the happiest man in these mountains. We should tell James tomorrow, Catherine suggested. He'll be an uncle. And Sheriff Miller, he's been like a father to us both. He deserves to know he'll be a grandfather of sorts. The news spread through their small community with the speed of wildfire. Congratulations poured in. Dr. Patterson insisted on examining Catherine monthly riding up from Ordway, despite the difficult journey. Mary Henderson, now officially courting James, brought preserves and advice. The wives of trappers and miners offered hand-me-down baby clothes and cradles. Catherine's pregnancy progressed normally through the spring and summer. Her belly swelled, and she felt the first flutters of movement in late May, quickening into stronger kicks as the baby grew. She continued her healing work, though Elijah insisted she stop lifting heavy things and let him or James handle the more physically demanding tasks. By early autumn, Catherine was enormous, her back aching constantly, her ankles swollen. But she glowed with health and happiness, one hand frequently resting on her belly, feeling the baby's movements, marveling at the life growing inside her. What should we name him? Elijah asked one night. They'd both become convinced the baby was a boy, though neither could say why. I've been thinking about that, Catherine said. What would you say to Jonas after your father? Elijah's eyes misted. You'd do that, name our son after Pa. He taught you to catch those who fall, and you caught me. That lesson shaped both our lives. It seems fitting to honor it. Jonas Elijah Thorne, Elijah said, testing the name. I like it. I like it very much. Labor began on a crisp October morning, 3 weeks before Catherine's due date. She woke to a gush of fluid and cramping pains that stole her breath. Elijah, already awake and tending the fire, took one look at her face and knew. It's time. It's time, Catherine confirmed, wincing as another contraction gripped her. James rode hard for Dr. Patterson while Elijah helped Catherine prepare. They'd set up the bedroom for the birth weeks ago with clean linens, boiled water, the supplies Catherine had assembled from treating other women's labors. Now those preparations would serve her own delivery. The labor progressed slowly, as first births often did. By afternoon, Catherine's contractions were coming hard and fast, but the baby seemed in no hurry to arrive. Dr. Patterson arrived as the sun began to set, examining Catherine with his experienced hands. The baby's breech, he announced, his expression grave. Feet first instead of head down. We need to try to turn it. Catherine knew the risks. Breech births were dangerous, often fatal for mother or child or both. But she also knew Dr. Patterson's skill and trusted him completely. Do what you need to do, she said through gritted teeth. What followed was agony beyond anything Catherine had experienced, worse even than being shot. Patterson's hands probed and pushed, trying to manually rotate the baby into the proper position. Catherine screamed, clutching Elijah's hand hard enough to leave bruises. Sweat poured down her face, her body shaking with the effort of enduring. Almost there, Patterson muttered, his own face strained with concentration. Just a little more. Catherine felt something shift inside her, a sensation of the baby moving, rotating. Patterson's face showed relief. Got it. The baby's head down now, but Catherine, you're going to need to push soon. This baby's ready to come. The final stage of labor blurred into a haze of pain, effort, and determination. Catherine bore down with each contraction, following Dr. Patterson's instructions, drawing on reserves of strength she didn't know she possessed. Elijah stayed at her head, coaching her, encouraging her, his presence, an anchor in the storm of childbirth. Finally, after what felt like hours but was probably only 20 minutes, Patterson's voice changed, taking on an urgent note. One more push, Catherine, I can see the head. One more, no. Catherine gathered every bit of strength remaining in her exhausted body and pushed. The sensation of the baby leaving her body was overwhelming, part relief, part loss, wholly transformative. Then cutting through the haze came the most beautiful sound she'd ever heard. A baby's cry, strong, indignant, full of life. It's a boy, Dr. Patterson announced, holding up the squirming infant. You have a son. The doctor quickly cleaned the baby, tied off the umbilical cord, and placed the tiny bundle on Catherine's chest. She looked down through tears of joy and exhaustion at the small face, red and scrunched eyes squeezed shut against the brightness of the world. "Hello, Jonas," she whispered. "Welcome to the world, little one." Elijah stood beside the bed, staring at his son with an expression of absolute wonder. When the baby's tiny hand wrapped around his finger, gripping with surprising strength, a tear rolled down the mountain man's weathered cheek. "He's perfect," Elijah breathed. "Catherine, he's perfect." Dr. Patterson finished tending to Catherine, checking her for complications, ensuring the afterbirth had delivered completely. "You did wonderfully," he told her. "Mother and baby both healthy despite the breech presentation. You're going to be just fine." James appeared in the doorway, having waited anxiously in the other room. "Is everyone all right? Can I meet my nephew?" Catherine smiled tiredly. "Come meet Jonas." James approached slowly, almost reverently, looking down at the baby with an expression of awe. "He's so small. I didn't think people started out this small." "You were this small once," Catherine reminded him, "and look how you turned out." "That's not necessarily reassuring," James joked, but his eyes were damp as he gently touched the baby's downy head. "Hello, Jonas. I'm your Uncle James, and I promise to always protect you, to tell you stories, and to teach you everything your parents are too proper to mention." Over the following weeks, the trading post transformed into a haven of new parenthood. Catherine recovered quickly, her body responding to the demands of nursing and caring for an infant with surprising resilience. Jonas proved to be a good baby, crying only when hungry or wet, sleeping in reasonable stretches, and already developing a personality that seemed to mirror his father's calm steadiness. Elijah was besotted. Catherine would often find him simply standing by the cradle watching Jonas sleep, his expression soft with love. He learned to change diapers, to swaddle the baby in tight bundles, that calmed crying Jags, to walk the floor at night when Catherine needed rest. "You're a natural father," Catherine observed one evening, watching Elijah gently rock Jonas to sleep. "Had a good teacher," Elijah replied. "My papa showed me what it means to be a father. Now I get to pass that on to Jonas." Sheriff Miller rode up in December, bringing gifts for the baby and news from the outside world. Holloway had died in prison before his scheduled execution consumption, taking him in November. Mother Superior Agnes was serving her sentence, reportedly aged 20 years, in the months since her conviction. The trafficking ring had been completely dismantled. The children who could be traced returned to families or placed in legitimate orphanages. 127 children freed, Miller told them as they sat by the fire. "Because you were brave enough to run and smart enough to get proof. That's your legacy, Catherine." "Our legacy," Catherine corrected, looking at Elijah. "None of this would have been possible if Elijah hadn't caught me, if he hadn't believed me, if he hadn't stood with me." "Well then," Miller said, raising his coffee cup, "to both of you, and to young Jonas, born into a world made a little bit better by his parents' courage." The years flowed past like the creek that ran through the trading post property each season, bringing its own challenges and joys. Jonas grew into a bright, curious boy with his father's green eyes and his mother's quick mind. Catherine's healing practice expanded, and she became known throughout the territory as Healer Catherine, the woman who could cure what ailed you and deliver your babies with skill and compassion. In the spring of 1883, Catherine gave birth to a daughter they named Sarah, after Sarah Mackenzie. The birth was easier than Jonas's had been, and the baby girl proved to have lungs that could wake the dead and a temperament as fierce as the mountains that surrounded them. James married Mary Henderson in a small ceremony at the trading post, with Sheriff Miller officiating in his capacity as Justice of the Peace. They built a cabin nearby, and Mary's son thrived under James's patient guidance. A year later, Mary gave birth to a daughter they named Emma, honoring Sheriff Miller's lost child. The old lawman wept when they told him, and from that day forward, he doted on little Emma as if she were truly his grandchild. Michael arrived in 1885, a happy baby who laughed more than he cried and seemed content to watch the world with wondering eyes. The trading post rang with the sounds of children's laughter, of family growing and thriving. The community that formed around the trading post grew as well. More families settled in the area, drawn by word of Catherine's healing skills and Elijah's fair trading practices. A small school formed, meeting in the trading post's main room twice a week, with Catherine teaching reading and writing to the dozen or so children within traveling distance. By 1890, the settlement had grown large enough to warrant a name. The residents gathered for a meeting and voted unanimously to call it Thorn's Landing, honoring the couple whose courage and compassion had made the community possible. Catherine's medical journal, a detailed record of treatments and remedies, combining Sarah Mackenzie's knowledge with her own discoveries, became a reference used by healers throughout the territory. Women came from hundreds of miles away, seeking Catherine's help with difficult pregnancies, mysterious illnesses, injuries that local doctors couldn't treat. She delivered over 400 babies in her decades of practice, trained 5 other women in midwifery, and wrote a comprehensive manual she titled Mountain Healing that would be used by frontier women for 70 years. Elijah continued trapping and trading, but increasingly his focus shifted to community building. He helped new settlers build their cabins, organize wagon trains, to bring supplies from Denver, served as unofficial mediator when disputes arose between neighbors. The violent mountain man who'd killed 3 outlaws in revenge became a pillar of peace and stability, living his father's lesson every day. Jonas grew into a tall, strong young man who loved the mountains as much as his father did. He became a skilled guide leading hunters and tourists through the high country, teaching them to respect the wilderness that had raised him. Sarah surprised everyone by declaring at age 15 that she wanted to be a doctor, a real doctor with formal training. She left for medical school in Boston at 18 and returned with her degree at 23, opening a practice in Denver while maintaining close ties to Thorne's Landing. Michael chose a different path, buying a ranch in the valley and raising cattle, marrying a local girl, and filling his home with children who thought their Uncle Jonas and Aunt Sarah were the most exciting people in the world. As the new century turned, bringing automobiles and electricity and changes that would transform the West forever, Thorne's Landing remained a pocket of the old ways, where neighbors helped neighbors, where children were safe, where the mountains stood eternal and unchanging. Catherine and Elijah aged together, their love deepening rather than diminishing with the years. They celebrated their 25th wedding anniversary with a party that brought people from 100 miles around. Their 50th anniversary in 1930 was quieter, just family gathered at the trading post they'd never left. Catherine was 77, then her golden hair now silver, her body showing the accumulated aches of decades of hard work. But her blue eyes still held the fierce determination that had carried her through being shot, hunted, and nearly killed. And when she looked at Elijah, 83 years old with a beard gone white as snow, her expression still softened with love. That winter, the coldest in 30 years, pneumonia swept through the high country. Catherine, weakened by age, caught it while tending to a sick child. For 3 weeks, she fought with Elijah, never leaving her side, holding her hand through fever dreams, spooning broth into her when she was lucid enough to swallow. Sarah came from Denver bringing the latest medicines, but they both knew this was a battle Catherine's body was too tired to win. On a February evening with snow falling soft outside the window and Elijah holding her close, Catherine's breathing grew shallow. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "For what?" Elijah asked, his own voice thick with tears. "For catching me, for loving me, for giving me a life I never dreamed possible." "You gave me the same," Elijah replied. "You woke me up, Catherine. You taught me how to live again." She smiled, her hand weak in his. "The scar on my back. Make sure our grandchildren know. Make sure they understand that sometimes the worst moments lead to the best things." "I will," Elijah promised. "I'll tell them the whole story." Catherine's eyes drifted closed. "I love you, Elijah Thorne. I love you, Catherine Reed Thorne. Always have, always will." Her breathing slowed, softened, and then so gently it was almost imperceptible, stopped. Elijah held her as her spirit left, tears streaming down his weathered face, grieving even as he gave thanks for 51 years together that had transformed them both. They buried Catherine on a hillside overlooking the trading post, where she could see the mountains she'd come to love. The entire community turned out for the funeral, hundreds of people whose lives she'd touched, babies she'd delivered, now grown with children of their own, women she'd healed, families she'd helped. Reverend Ashford, 93 years old and so frail he had to be helped to the graveside, spoke the eulogy. Catherine Reed Thorne was shot in the back while running from evil. A mountain man caught her before she hit the ground. That moment of grace, that choice to catch someone who was falling, didn't just save one life. It transformed a community. It brought healing where there was hurt, hope where there was despair, and love where loneliness had reigned. The Reverend looked at Elijah, standing straight despite his grief. Jonas Thorne taught his son to always catch those who fall. Elijah caught Catherine, and together they caught hundreds more. That's the legacy they leave us. Not just children and grandchildren, though those are precious, but the understanding that we're called to catch each other, to lift each other up, to never walk past someone who's falling. Elijah lived on at the trading post for 2 more years after Catherine's death. His children wanted him to move to town to live with one of them, where he'd have more care, but he refused. "This is where I caught her," he told Jonas. "This is where we built our life. I'll leave it when it's time to join her and not before." He spent his days maintaining the property, visiting with neighbors, playing with his grandchildren and great-grandchildren when they came to see him. And each evening he'd sit on the porch in his rocking chair, Catherine's favorite shawl draped over the empty chair beside him, and talk to her as if she could still hear. "Had a good day today," he'd say to the empty air. "Jonas brought his youngest up, little girl with your eyes. She asked about the trading post, wanted to know all the stories. I told her about the first time you delivered a baby, how scared you were until that child cried, and then you knew you'd found your calling." He'd pause as if listening to a response only he could hear. "I miss you, Catherine. Every day, every hour. But I'm grateful too. Grateful for every moment we had. You were the best thing that ever happened to me." On an October afternoon in 1932, 18-year-old Michael Thorne Jonas and Catherine's grandson came to visit his grandfather. He found Elijah on the porch, rocking slowly, staring at the mountains. "Grandpa," Michael said, settling into Catherine's chair, "I leave tomorrow, for the army." Elijah looked at his grandson, seeing the fear poorly hidden beneath youthful bravado. "Scared. Terrified," Michael admitted. "What if I'm not brave enough when it counts?" Elijah was quiet for a long moment, considering his grandson, considering the story that had shaped his life. Then he spoke. "Let me tell you about your grandmother. About the scar on her back that you asked about when you were younger. It's a story about fear and courage, about falling and being caught, about how the worst moments can lead to the best things if we choose to face them." And so Elijah told the story, all of it, from the first shot in Ordway to Catherine's death in his arms. Michael listened with rapt attention, occasionally asking questions, more often simply absorbing the tale of his grandparents' extraordinary love forged in extraordinary circumstances. As the sun set on that October day, Elijah reached the end of his narrative. "Your grandmother was terrified when she was shot, terrified when she ran, terrified when she fought. But she did it anyway. Courage isn't the absence of fear, son. It's choosing to act despite it." He leaned forward, fixing Michael with an intense gaze. "In the war, you'll see people fall, literally and figuratively. Remember what my father taught me, what I taught your father, what I'm teaching you now. Always catch those who fall. Be the man who reaches out when others turn away. That's how you honor your grandmother's memory. That's how you become the man you're meant to be." Michael's eyes were damp. "I'll try, Grandpa. I promise I'll try." Elijah reached into his pocket and pulled out a small object. Catherine's rosary beads, the ones she'd set aside the night she renounced her vows and declared her love for him. "Your grandmother wanted you to have these. She kept them. Her whole life said they reminded her that faith isn't about rules or institutions, but about love's sacrifice and catching those who fall." Michael took the rosary with reverent hands. "I'll carry them with me. Keep them close." "That's good." Elijah settled back in his chair, suddenly looking every one of his 85 years. "One more thing, boy. When you find someone worth catching, someone who makes you feel alive in ways you didn't know were possible, don't let her go. I caught your grandmother once and held on to her for 51 years. Best decision I ever made." They sat together in comfortable silence as darkness fell over the mountains, grandfather and grandson linked by blood and story, and the lesson that had shaped 3 generations. Always catch those who fall. Michael left the next morning, with Elijah watching from the porch as the truck carrying his grandson disappeared down the mountain road. He raised one hand in farewell, then lowered it slowly, feeling the weight of his years. He returned to his rocking chair, Catherine's shawl still draped over the empty seat beside him. "He's a good boy, Catherine. You'd be proud. They're all good, all our children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren. We built something that lasts." Elijah closed his eyes, the autumn sun warm on his face, and spoke to his wife one final time. "I miss you every moment, but I'll see you soon enough. Just a little longer, and then I'll catch you again wherever you are, just like I promised." The mountains stood eternal around him, witnesses to a love story that had begun with a gunshot and a fall, and had transformed into a legacy that would echo through generations. Jonas Elijah Thorne would go on to have 7 children of his own, all of them taught to catch those who fall. Sarah Catherine Thorne would practice medicine for 40 years, delivering hundreds of babies and training dozens of female doctors in an era when such things were rare. Michael James Thorne would survive World War II, return home to his ranch, and raise 9 children who all learned their great-grandfather's lesson. Thorne's Landing thrived, growing into a town of several hundred families, while maintaining the spirit of community and mutual support that Catherine and Elijah had established. The trading post became a museum in 1950, preserved exactly as Catherine had left it, with Sarah Mackenzie's journals and Catherine's medical manual on display for visitors to learn from. In the town square, a bronze statue was erected in 1935. It showed a man catching a falling woman, her face turned up to his, the moment of connection captured in metal for all time. The plaque read simply, "The Federal Investigation." Catherine's bravery had led to the rescue of 1,200 children from trafficking operations across the Western Territories. Her medical manual was used by frontier women for 70 years. The community she and Elijah built still exists today, a testament to what 2 people can accomplish when they choose love over fear, action over hiding, and connection over isolation. And somewhere in the mountains above Thorne's Landing, if you're quiet enough and the wind is right, old-timers swear you can still hear it. The echo of a promise kept. The sound of strong arms catching someone who's falling. The whisper of a love that changed the world one caught soul at a time. Always catch those who fall. It was Jonas Thorne's lesson to his son. It became Elijah's gift to Catherine. Together they made it their legacy to everyone who came after. And that legacy lives on.